The Prophecy Club, a nationwide television program, a nationwide radio program. The Prophecy Club also hosts approximately 40 major city meetings per month. Our mission is to inform Christians of current events that confirm Bible prophecy, expose the evil devices of Satan, warn believers what is coming to America, challenge people to stop sinning and turn to Jesus with all their heart, and to provide a platform for Christian speakers to be heard.
It's a bald-faced lie.
Using their positions of power and authority in our own government.
The greatest oil field in the world is at the southwest end of the Dead Sea. He said, son, you must warn this nation.
And now your host for the Prophecy Club, Stan Johnson.
Welcome to the Prophecy Club, where we study and research Bible prophecy. Today's topic is 9/11 Contrived. Your speaker has been speaking out on issues like this for some 40 years. He's author of 2 books. He does a talk show himself, been doing it for some 7 years, and get this, it's 5 hours a day. I asked him, I said, now we do a 30-minute radio broadcast, and sometimes it's tough for me to come up with 30 minutes a day, but I said, how do you come up with 5 hours a day? And then I started interviewing him for the TV program. And as you're about to discuss or discover, this guy is a deep well of information. It just flows and flows and flows and flows and never seems to run dry of information. And I said, how do you remember such names, dates, places, just at the snap of a finger, even faster than a snap of a finger? He said, well, this has been my life. He said, this is what I do. So will you help me welcome Dr. Stan Monteith.
Thank you. Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae died in France in 1918, but shortly before his death, he penned these words. In Flanders Field, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the lark still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amidst the guns below. We are the dead. Scarce days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Field. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw, the torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Field. And those were really profound words. Years ago, they used to teach that poem in school, and they used to recite it at meetings, and grown men wept. But you stop and think of his statement, take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw. Who indeed was the foe? Who was responsible for that first great world war, this horrible, horrible war that produced 21 million casualties, 8.5 million soldiers who died, and another 12.5 million civilians, and there were probably twice that many people wounded who carried the pain of their wounds to the death with them. Who was responsible for that horrible war? Well, in America, we were told it was the wicked Kaiser, but if you read Kaiser Wilhelm's memoirs, he will tell you he never understood the war. He never understood how it came about. He pointed a finger at a man named Sir Edward Grey, who was the British foreign minister, but then he talked about a secret Masonic conspiracy he had been told about. But he never understood the war. And after the war, why people began talking about the munitions manufacturers. Maybe they were responsible, or maybe it was the bankers, because they made so much money during the war. And an awful lot of people began to believe that the wars were fought for financial advantage. And that, of course, was one reason why communism seemed to grow and why it was so attractive to so many people. The First World War resulted in the destruction of the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire and the introduction of communism into Russia, the Turkish Empire. There were revolutions in Italy. The First World War changed the world forever. And yet today, most people have no idea why the war came about. Well, Abraham Lincoln addressed that issue in 1838 when he addressed the Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois, and this is what he said. At what point should we expect the approach of danger? By what means should we fortify ourselves against it? Should we expect some transatlantic giant to step the ocean and crush us with a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe and Asia and Africa combined could never by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a mark on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. Then at what point should we expect the approach of danger? And I answer, if it ever reaches, it must spring up among us. It can never come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, then we ourselves must be its authors and its finishers. As a nation of free men, we shall live through all time or die by suicide. As a nation of free men, we shall live through all time or die by suicide. And he was talking about this whole movement beginning here in America, if we were to be destroyed. Well, we recently saw that horrible, horrible picture emblazoned in our minds of the tragedy of what happened on September 11th of last year. On September 13th, the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, addressed a group of reporters, and he said this: undoubtedly, the war will be a lot more like a Cold War than a hot war. If you think about it, the Cold War took 50 years, plus or minus. 50 years. We're talking about a war against terrorism for 50 years. The following day, on September the 14th, former Senator Gary Hart was addressing an emergency meeting of the Council on Foreign Relations convened in Washington, D.C., and he said this: there is a chance for the President of the United States to use this disaster to carry out what his father, a phrase his father, I think, used only once and hasn't been used since, and that is a New World Order. There is a chance for the President of the United States to use this disaster. To use this disaster. What a horrible and crass thought. While the embers of the World Trade Center are still, hot and difficult even to get in to search for people, they're talking about using the disaster. Why would you talk about using the disaster of what happened on September 11th? Well, on September the 15th, George Bush went on to radio, his regular address, and he said this: you'll be asked for your patience, for the conflict will not be short. You'll be asked for your resolve, for the conflict will not be easy. You'll be asked for your strength, for the course to victory may be long. We're talking about a long, long, long war against terrorism. On the 16th, an article appeared on the op-ed page of the New York Times, basically they were talking about the remarks by Vice President Cheney. He talked about the unspeakable air attack and that we just had no idea. We'd been caught totally unprepared, but then he did mention that there had been information that a big operation was planned, but the unspeakable air attack, I mean, how could we possibly have anticipated that? On the 18th of September, the BBC News article carried an article by a man named George Amory, who said that the United States had been planning to attack the Taliban by October. And they simply quoted a man, a former Pakistani foreign secretary named Niak Niaz, who had been told in July of last year that the United States would be at war with the Taliban by October. Now, how would you possibly get the American people to go to war with Afghanistan? On September 10th of last year, nobody wanted to go to war with Afghanistan, and certainly nobody wanted to go to war in Iraq or with the nations of the Muslim world. By the 12th, the American people were ready to do almost anything to retaliate against the wicked people responsible for that horrible specter we saw on the 11th of September. On the 20th of September of last year, the President of the United States, George Bush, addressed Congress and talked about, of course, how we were the major source of humanitarian aid for Afghanistan. And you can get that speech. You can call the White House and ask for his speech. It's available from the Public Relations Office there. We were the major source of funding for Afghanistan. Now, if you stop and think about it, Afghanistan was the Taliban. We were the major source of funding for the Taliban. What's wrong with this picture? If you go, and we have a number of references to it, a book, Dollars for Terror, another book called Unholy Wars, written by John Cooley, and these books were written in 1999. You'll find out the United States had funded the Taliban. The United States had created the Taliban, working along with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia back in 1994. The word Taliban means student, and these, of course, were students from Pakistan trained in the schools there in the radical form of Islam, and they were the ones who invaded Afghanistan with funding from the United States government. But you see, most people don't really understand so much of what's going on today, and tragically, most people really don't understand why the attack occurred. That week, Jean Chrétien, who was the Prime Minister of Canada, had made the remark, there was a great resolution passed by the United Nations last night that might bring about a new world, a new order in the world that would be better for all of us. There was a great resolution passed by the United Nations last night that might bring about a new order in the world that would be better for all of us. So we're talking about a 50-year war. We're talking about a new world order. We're talking about the Taliban, and of course the Taliban are the enemy, but of course people don't realize that we financed the Taliban. And so are things exactly as they appear to be, or are we being lied to? I start my programs 5 hours every day with the same statement. Reality is usually scoffed at. Illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it will be reality, not illusion or delusion, that will determine what the future will bring. So who is the enemy? Well, there are many sources and many different ideas about who the enemy is. To understand wars, let me take you to Plato. Plato, that great philosopher of antiquity, and of course, if you go to college, why, you will be asked to read his Republic, and this is what he said in the Republic. When the tyrant has disposed of foreign enemies by conquest or treaty, and there is nothing to fear from them, then he is always stirring up some war or other in order that the people may require a leader. When the tyrant has disposed of foreign enemies by conquest or treaty, and there is nothing to fear from them, then he's always stirring up some war or other in order that the people may require a leader. Is that really true? Are wars created so that people will rally behind the leader? Most of you probably have heard that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. That statement is made frequently. We don't know whether he started the fire, but certainly he did nothing to put it out. Nero, the Roman Empire, used the burning of Rome to justify attacking the Christians and rally the Roman people behind him. Adolf Hitler burned the Reichstag so that he could use that to rally the people behind him. It's very difficult many times for people to imagine that leaders will slaughter large numbers of human beings for psychological purposes. And yet, how many of you have seen the movie We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson, who plays the part of Colonel Halmore? If you haven't seen it, see the movie. It's a powerful, powerful movie. A little language that you might not appreciate, but that's the way it is in war. It's the story of a battalion that is dropped into to an area where they think there's some of the North Vietnamese, but basically it's the North Vietnamese command post. It's an ambush. Our boys are dropped into an ambush, and it was a terrible battle. I think they lost 75 soldiers killed, and I don't know how many wounded. One of the first big encounters of the war. Afterwards, they said, "Oh, was it just a terrible mistake that we dropped you into the, the North Vietnamese command post?" But was it a mistake? I don't know how many of you remember the Operation Tailwind. About 2 years ago, it got a lot of coverage on CNN. That was put out by a woman named April Oliver, and of course, Peter Arnett did the voiceover on it. There was the story of a group of special forces, maybe a dozen of them or so, with 100 Montagnards who were dropped into Laos. Their job was, of course, to try out a new type of gas. It was a sarin gas. It was a poison gas, and of course, to kill American deserters. Now, of course, immediately CNN was attacked, and April Oliver was sued, and she lost her job, and Peter Arnett was disciplined, and eventually, of course, he was let go by CNN because of that story. But the trouble is, it was a true story. I interviewed Lieutenant von Buskirk, who was the second in command. And where did they drop them in Laos? They dropped them into a North Vietnamese command post, surrounded. But it was a very effective means of finding whether the gas would work. It did work. We had gas masks, they didn't. Their men died. Most of ours got out safely. But they were sent in, of course, to kill American deserters. But we can't let the American people understand that, because that wasn't even a war. It was never a declared war. It was simply a sort of a police action, fought for far different reasons than the men who went there to bleed and suffer and die were ever allowed to know, or than most Americans know today. But we're going to tell you a little bit about Vietnam, but that's later in the story. One only has to go into the First World War to the story of Gallipoli. Winston Churchill was the Lord of the Admiralty at the time. Every military commander in the British Army objected to sending a force into Gallipoli because it was, close to Turkey. It was an area where you could establish a beachhead, but behind it were impenetrable mountains. There was no way they could possibly get through them. 240,000 British soldiers fell at Gallipoli, 150,000 Turks fell at Gallipoli, opposing them for a totally senseless invasion. Didn't make any sense. Any more than the Bay of Pigs made any sense. It was the only place you could have put those men ashore on the island of Cuba, the anti-Castro Cubans, where they were ensured to fail, because behind them was an impenetrable thicket, and there was only one road out of the Bay of Pigs, and that was past a camp with 5,000 soldiers in training for Fidel Castro's army. I talked to the man who was in charge of the war room of the Pentagon at that time. He said, we went out and got drunk when we realized that they changed the landing spot to the Bay of Pigs because we knew they'd been sent in to die. But it's difficult for the average American to understand that our leaders would send men purposely into battle to die. I don't know how many of you saw the search for Private Ryan. It was a fascinating, very, very descriptive story of the Second World War, and it showed the invasion of Normandy. But what most Americans do not understand is the invasion of Normandy was never necessary. That horror that you witnessed on the screen really took place. I had the opportunity, the unique opportunity, to spend some time with General Albert Wedemeyer, who was in charge of planning for the War Department during the Second World War. And of course, by 1993, early 1943, we were ready to invade Europe. I mean, to end the war, to finish this war, to stop it. And of course, his plan was to invade Vichy France, not fortified, soft underbelly of Europe, easy to get through. But Winston Churchill, the same Winston Churchill who insisted on Gallipoli, would not allow that. In fact, he put up such opposition, he got General Wedemeyer transferred off to India and used his persuasive influence with FDR to get rid of General Wedemeyer, insisted on invading North Africa, absolutely no purpose at all for that campaign, then insisted on going, instead of invading the southern part of France, we invaded Italy, a narrow peninsula, heavily fortified. Of course, and the tragedy was, we lost more men in the invasion of Anzio than General MacArthur lost in all of his invasions in the South Pacific. All of the invasions of the South Pacific. And of course, we could have gone in 43 and ended the war by invading France, but they weren't allowed to do it because not enough men would have died. And you say that can't be. I mean, our leaders couldn't do that. Well, you have to understand who Winston Churchill really was. And as we progress with our story, you'll learn much more about Winston Churchill. Well, Let me tell you about Operation Northwood. You can get this up on the internet. You can get it through my ministry. There's a book called Body of Secrets written by James Bamford. It's on NSA. He goes into this in great detail. It was a plan that was put together by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1962. How could we get into a war with Cuba? The Bay of Pigs invasion had failed. Our Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted an invasion with Cuba, so they came up with all sorts of alternatives. How can we get an invasion of Cuba? Well, at that time, of course, we were putting satellites into space by themselves. And there was one going to be going up, a satellite that was going to carry John Glenn. They figured that if they blew up the satellite that was going up, the rocket that was going up, and killed John Glenn, and we could blame that on Fidel Castro, that would inflame the American people. Or maybe we could sink some of the boats coming in from Cuba with refugees on them. Or maybe we could sink some of our own ships in the harbor in Guantanamo and blame it on Fidel. Or we could dress up some anti-Castro Cubans in Cuban uniforms and then kill them and then leave them there at Guantanamo and say that, we had been invaded by Fidel Castro. But the best means that they came up with, and this was a highly classified document, and has only recently been declassified, and of course we'll just show you a picture of it here. It is available on the internet. It's available through our ministry. The solution was that they finally thought the most efficient thing would be a plane loaded with students, and they were going to be flying for a vacation in South America. And this plane was going to be loaded with students, and everybody was going to see them off. And the plane was going to start flying south. It was going to fly over Cuba. It was going to drop down below radar and, of course, land, presumably. Another plane was going to be in the air, looked just exactly the same, was going to fly over Cuba, announced that it was under attack, put out a Mayday call, be blown up by internal explosives, and now we would be able to go to war with Cuba. Well, fortunately, the plan was shown to McNamara, who gave it to President Kennedy, who said, no way. And that was the end of Operation Northwood. But there are really people who think in this manner, because these are people who march to a different drum beat, who dream a different dream. And even in those days, in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, there were people who were dedicated to this internationalist dream of establishing a new world order, with America leading the world in that direction. Well, let me take you to a short review of history, because you can't understand anything going on today unless you understand the past. And so if we're going to begin, why, we ought to begin at the beginning. And of course, it really begins with Genesis. And at that time, you remember the story that was told, Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden, and of course the serpent came to Eve and said, you know, the Lord's told you not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but you're not going to surely die if you eat of it. Go ahead, go ahead, try it. It's good for you. And so they did. And of course, when it had become obvious that Adam and Eve had violated God's orders, in Genesis 3:22, we're told this. And the Lord God said, behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and also take of the tree of the life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden. And that's how it all began. Noah lived about 2600 BC. These dates are a little vague. Nobody can be absolutely certain of them. But this is the time of the Great Flood. Why was there a Great Flood? Because the world had become totally evil. Because the fallen angels had cohabitated with women and generated the Nephilim, and the world was totally corrupt. And so God destroyed everyone and everything but Noah and those that he preserved. Well, it was 150, 200 years later when the world was once again corrupted. Nimrod was going to unite the whole world and build a temple to the heavens. And God once again intervened, and of course at that time, why he went ahead and made people speak different languages. You fast forward then to the time of Moses, about 1350, 1250 BC, and you remember the story of Moses going before Pharaoh, and he says, the Lord God has said, let my people go, and he casts down his staff, and it turns into a serpent. And of course the Pharaoh turns to his priests and says, what are you going to do? And they cast their staffs down, and they turn into serpents too, because the priests who served the Pharaoh, had supernatural power. And people don't understand there has always been power out there for the taking. Daniel, of course, was taken away into captivity under Nebuchadnezzar. And, of course, it was at that time when the Jews were living in Babylon that many of the ideas, the occult ideas of the ancient mystery religions began to be introduced into certain of their beliefs, but also the Christian beliefs were manifested and the prophecies were manifested to the Magi. In fact, some people say that Daniel was appointed head of the Magi, even though, of course, he wasn't one of them, but he was very favored by the kings. And so he was beginning to introduce some of the ancient Jewish writings into their society, just as the influence of the mystery religions of antiquity had been introduced into the Jewish religion. Well, we fast forward then to the time of Pythagoras. Now, most of you, if you took geometry, will remember the Pythagorean dictum that a square plus b square equals c square. Now, that means that the square of the two sides of a right-angled triangle is equal to the square of the hypotenuse of the right-angled triangle. I mean, it is an amazing thing if you stop and think of it. Have you ever wondered where that came from? Do you think that Pythagoras sat down one day and scratched his head and he said, I've been thinking a square plus b square probably equals c square. Let's just see if that's true. No. He had gone to the Near East and he tapped into the mysteries, the secrets of the mystery religions. In fact, he returned from the Near East and established a school in southern Italy, which at that time was under Greek domination, where they actually began to teach the mysteries, these secrets that had been passed down by the sages throughout all history, but never recorded. Because, you see, if they were ever recorded, it could cost people their lives. But they were always passed on by oral tradition. And then, of course, Socrates, 2 generations later. Well, Socrates really never wrote anything. We know about Socrates because of Plato's writings. Socrates' student was Plato. And if you've read the Republic, Plato advocated creating a new world order with a ruling elite, a ruling oligarchy headed by a philosopher king, a military class that would oppress the people and that everybody else would be enslaved. And of course, there would be no families. Women were to belong to all men. The children would belong to the state. And there are many, many people who believe that what he suggested in his Republic would really be truly a utopian society. He wrote something in his dialogues. He wrote the Republic. He wrote the dialogues. In the dialogues, he talked about ancient Atlantis. Ancient Atlantis was this wonderful utopian society that existed with far advanced knowledge, and it had been destroyed by a great flood. Some people say, is that the Noahic flood? We'll never know. Maybe Atlantis never existed. But it was always a dream, this ideal where far advanced science and men and women could live in this utopian society. And it was all lost when Atlantis was lost. Aristotle was the student of Plato, and of course his student was a man named Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great set off to conquer the world. And by the time he died at 34, he had conquered almost all of the known world. Did you ever wonder how Alexander the Great, with a small band of Macedonians, was able to conquer the entire world? He went up against the army of Darius. I mean, Darius had elephants, he had legions, and Alexander the Great, with a small band of Macedonians, defeated them. And few people have ever bothered to ask why or how it was accomplished. Well, there's a wonderful book. It's called Plutarch's The Age of Alexander, and or The Life of Alexander. Basically in that book, why Alexander the Great writes to Aristotle, and he is furious with him. He said, you had taught me the mysteries, because you see, Alexander the Great had been schooled in the mystery religions. And he said, you taught me the mysteries, and this gives me power over the men, and now you've written a book about them. And you've written a book, and other people are going to understand this. I will lose my ability to control others with this information that you've imparted to them. And Aristotle wrote back and said, no, you can actually read a book, but unless you've been schooled in the mysteries, you'll totally miss it. This will not do you any harm. And so it was that, as you know, Alexander died, and his great empire was partitioned. But what people don't understand is the influence of the mystery religions, the influence of the occult on the empire that he had left. You remember at the time of Christ, you remember the Magi came, the three wise men came from Persia? Now, they weren't, of course, Christians, but they knew from the writings of Daniel that it was at this time in history that the new king of the Jews was to be born, and that's why they came bearing gifts. There was, of course, another story, and you'll remember when Jesus goes to the Mount of Temptation and encounters the devil. And the devil says, if you'll just fall down and worship me, I can give you all the kingdoms of this world. And, of course, Jesus says, you know, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. But did you ever wonder how the devil could offer all of the kingdoms of this world? Unless, of course, he had control over them. There were other stories, of course, when Jesus goes to Gerizim and he meets the demoniac, and of course, as he approaches him, the man says, what have you to do with us, Jesus? And of course, Jesus casts out the devils, they go into the swine, and most people read these stories and they sort of smile and, well, you know, what does this all have to do? It has a great deal to do with what's going on in the world today, but most people have no concept at all of the story as it's unfolding before us today. The Roman Empire, of course, overlapped the time of Jesus, lasted till 476. They were involved in war after war. And, of course, what happened, the taxes got so high to finance the wars that a lot of the people who owned land eventually couldn't pay the taxes on their land. They ended up working for somebody else who owned their land. With this came the wars, and the affluence came apathy and indifference and immorality and homosexuality and the destruction of the family and bread and circuses, sort of like our welfare and Monday night football. And Rome fell in 476, and the world was plunged into darkness. And of course, this was the time of feudalism where men controlled other men and feudal lords and constant wars. Then came the Crusades, and in 1118, on Temple Mount in Jerusalem, an order was formed. It was known as the Knights Templar. Now, this was a group of men who were supposedly there to help immigrants, people coming from Europe who wanted to go to the Holy Land, you know, because this was the birthplace of Christ. But the Templars actually began to study the mysteries. They began to study the mystery religions to find out what the secret was that had been passed down by the sages through all time. And their order lasted until 1307. Now, they became the wealthiest force in all of Europe. They became the central bankers of Europe. And, of course, the monarchies and the papacy all owed them money. And then on the Friday the 13th of October, 1307, Friday the 13th of October, 1307, Jacques de Molay, the head of the Templars, was arrested, charged with heresy, and a few years later he was burned at the stake. The Templars then disappeared. They dissipated. Some of them went to Scotland. And, of course, there's a great deal to suggest that they were there. The question is often asked, why were they destroyed? Well, some people will tell you the Templars were destroyed because the papacy and the kings of England didn't want to pay back the money they owed. And that is the information you'll get from people who want to defend the Templars. But if you read the writings of a man named Manly P. Hall, and any major city in the United States has a metaphysical bookstore in it, and you go to the metaphysical bookstore, you can get the writings of Manly P. Hall. He was the world's leading occult philosopher and Satanist when he died here about a decade ago. But if you read his book, the Lectures in Ancient Philosophy, he will tell you why Jacques de Molay and the Templars had to be destroyed, because they had accessed the secret, you see, and they had to be destroyed because of it. Well, then, of course, the Magna Carta was signed in 1215. This was the first time you had this idea that men did not have to do everything the king said. The king, up to that time, was total power. If the king decreed something, it became the law of the land. And if you were a nobleman and he didn't like you, he took your land, he took your wife, he took your property, and that was the end of you. And so the nobles of England didn't feel there was much job security in that. So They took old King John of England out in the woods, and at the sword point they got him to sign the Magna Carta, which began to limit the power of government over the lives of the people. And this idea then that men could actually have a certain rights that were individual rights. John Wycliffe actually translated the Bible from Latin into English in the 1300s. And suddenly people then at least would have the ability to read the Bible. The trouble was, how would you get hold of a Bible? I mean, they were all written on scrolls. And then in 1448, Johann Gutenberg actually created the printing press. What a wonderful thing it was, because now you could actually begin to mass produce Bibles. And that's really what the printing press was for, was to produce Bibles so people could learn the Word of God. 1459, along come the Rosicrucians. They are a secret sect who's tapped into the mysteries, the same mysteries that the Templars had tapped into, the same mysteries that the Magi knew, these same mysteries that were always passed down by oral tradition. 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered America, and you read his writings. Of course, he wanted to go on this great adventure because he wanted to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so you had these two forces at work. One was the mysteries, and the other was Christianity, vying for domination in the world. William Tyndale, of course, translated the Bible and paid for it with his life. He was executed. 1517, Martin Luther, who was a dedicated Catholic. He didn't want to destroy the Catholic Church at all. He wanted to reform the Catholic Church. He saw what it was doing, the terrible things that they were doing, and they were wrong. And nobody wanted to admit it. And of course, that eventually led to the Council of Trent and at least some basic reforms within the Catholic Church. John Calvin, born 1509, actually he was born about 8 years before. Calvin actually posted the edict up there at the wall of the door of the Church of Wittenberg. John Calvin became known as the Pope of Geneva, and he began to codify the Protestant religion, but in many ways they were as wrong as the Catholics. They used to burn people at the stake if they didn't agree with their interpretation of the Scriptures. And then we began to see other people coming along. John Knox was a Scottish theologian. John Knox lived not only in Scotland, but he lived part of his life in Geneva. And John Knox began talking about a man's right to revolt against tyranny, revolt against government if it wasn't according to God's law. And man not only had a right, he had an obligation to oppose tyranny if it violated God's law. And then Samuel Rutherford, a Scots theologian, wrote something called Lex Rex. The law is king. Lex, the law. Rex is king. The law is king. And it was this whole idea that all men are born in sin. The king is born in sin. Man is born in sin. What right does the king have to rule over other people? All men are created equal. And that was the basic concept. All men are created equal, of Lex Rex. And then John Locke came along. And John Locke began to write about nature's God and nature's law. And there is in nature a representation of the God of the Bible. And of course, he believed in the right of life and liberty and property. And he wrote about that God had given us these inherent rights. Nature had given us these inherent rights. Baron Montesquieu was a French philosopher, and he wrote about the importance of republics. He thought a republic was the ideal form of government. And Sir William Blackstone, who wrote the commentaries on the laws of England, began to codify all of the writings of Locke and of the others, and began to point, and he actually wrote that all law is based upon the Bible. And actually, Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England was the basis of American law for the first 150 years of the existence of our great nation. But that's long since been forgotten. The Bible was the basis of all law. In fact, Charles Finney, who led the second great American Revolution, a great awakening, Charles Finney had started out to be a lawyer, and he was so taken by reading what Blackstone had written in the commentaries on the laws of England that he actually gave up the law and became a minister, and had such a profound effect on this country in the mid part of the 19th century. Well, the Jamestown colony was formed here in 1607, and the King James Bible came along in 1611. The Mayflower Compact, the Pilgrims arrived in 1620. And of course, all of this was to use this great country where we could establish a Christian nation. This is what these people wanted. Now, each one had their own means of worshiping God and within the Protestant framework, but it was primarily various Protestant groups, each one wanting to have the freedom of religion for themselves, but not necessarily for those who disagreed with them. The Rosicrucians arrived in America in 1630. Now, most people do not know that. But the Rosicrucians were sent over from England by a man named Francis Bacon, who'd written a book entitled The New Atlantis. And going back to Plato's writings of the old Atlantis, the lost Atlantis, this wonderful utopian society, the New Atlantis said we should use this new land across the ocean to establish a new Atlantis. And this new nation will lead the whole world into this wonderful utopian dream that Atlantis once was. Harvard University was formed in 1636, Yale University in 1701, and the occult influence in America had led to almost total depravity in this country by the 1730s. And people really do not understand that almost 100 years, over 100 years had gone by since the Jamestown colony, and America had become pretty much a depraved nation. And then along came a man named Jonathan Edwards, another man named Whitfield, and they, of course, English Masonry came here shortly after 1716 when it was established in Great Britain. The Jonathan Edwards in 1740 led the first Great Awakening. And he, of course, gave the same talk over and over again. A sinner in the hands of a vengeful God. And it said that it transformed America. And the people of this country turned back to God in large numbers. And it was out of this first Great Awakening that came the American Revolution. People turned back to God, hoping for a nation where they could be free. For they recognized that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And without the Spirit of the Lord, there will never be liberty for any man. And so it was, the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. And so many of the words and ideas that have been put forward by great people, like Samuel Rutherford, all men are created equal, and the writings of John Locke, who talked about nature's God and nature's law, and the right to life, liberty, and property. Of course, they substituted the word pursuit of happiness for property, but in the original text it was life, liberty, and property. And of course, the Declaration of Independence was written from a Christian worldview. People will attack our country because they say Thomas Jefferson was not a Christian. Well, I have his writings where he said he was. Now, he did not believe in the Trinity. He certainly didn't believe in John Calvin, because he knew that Calvin and the people over in Geneva were burning people at the stake if they didn't agree with him. He wanted a country where men could truly be free. But if you read his writings, and one of my most treasured books is The Master Thoughts of Thomas Jefferson, written back in 1907, long before they began to rewrite history in America. And he said unequivocally, I am a Christian, but in the only way that Christ would ever have us to be. And he didn't take all the other writings of the theologians or even of many of the apostles. But of course, he thought that the religion of Jesus Christ was the most wonderful in the world, contrary to everything that you are taught today. He was not a Trinitarian. He was not a Calvinist, and he opposed many of the ministers of that time, which is why he himself was opposed and why today they try to discredit him in every way they can. He even wrote a Bible for the Indians, in which he took out many of the references to the deity of Christ and the supernatural events, because as he told a friend, the Indians cannot understand this, and so I had to take those parts out of the Bible if we were going to lead the Christians into, the Indians into a belief in Christianity. Well, of course, then we had the French Revolution in 1789, an effort on the part of the French to create an ideal utopian society without God. They destroyed the Catholic Church. There was no religious foundation at all. We had the writings of people like Thomas Paine, The Age of Reason, There is no God. And when you try to create a society without God, you end up with chaos. And France went from one revolution to another. By 1790, why Illuminism had come to America. By 1833, the Skull and Bones was here. In 1848, a man named Lord Tennyson in England, who has written many of the great, great poems of that era. But of course, he wrote one poem that is seldom cited, except by those who really understand what this is all about. It was called Locksley Hall. In fact, in my Encyclopedia Americana, they have one large section on Tennyson. They have an entirely different section on Locksley Hall because they understood, the people who put together the Encyclopedia Americana, that this was key to everything going on. What Tennyson wrote was this: "For I dipped into the future far as any eye could see, saw a vision of the world and all the wonders that would be, heard the heavens filled with shouting and there rained a ghastly dew of the nation's airy navies grappling in the central blue, till the war drums throbbed no longer and the battle flags were furled in the parliament of man, the federation of the world." And it was all about creating a world government. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Just like Nimrod had tried to do, as Plato had written about, a world government. Well, in 1870, at Oxford University, there was a man named John Ruskin. And John Ruskin read Plato every day. And he believed in this wonderful, wonderful dream. And John Ruskin actually, in his inaugural lecture in 1870 at Oxford University, talked about this dream of a world under British domination. And sitting in his classes was a man named Cecil John Rhodes. And Cecil Rhodes was so enthralled with what he heard that day that he wrote down the speech in longhand and spent the rest of his life working in that direction. And he, of course, was able to get a great deal of money from some of his friends and went out to Africa to buy De Beers diamond mines, what came De Beers diamond mines, to buy the gold mines of South Africa that became Anglo-American, and to this very day they are still being used to pursue his goal and purpose. And that was the establishment of a world government. In 1875, Cecil Rhodes wrote his Confession of Faith, and this is what he said in part: "The idea gleaming and dancing before one's eyes like a will-o'-the-wisp at last frames itself into a plan. Why should we not form a secret society with but one object, the furtherance of the British Empire, for the bringing of the whole uncivilized world under British rule, for the recovery of the United States, for making of the Anglo-Saxon race but one empire?" In 1891, he created a secret society that did exactly that. But before we get to that, I want to tell you the story of the Great Zulu War, which took place in 1879. Because at that time, there were, within the hierarchy of the British government, many, many people who went along with this idea of Britain ruling the world. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had Britain ruling the world and we could bring our culture to the entire world? Well, where would you going to start this? Well, one of the places would be South Africa. It's always been key to things going on, and at that time, of course, the British controlled the Cape Colony, and the Boers controlled all the rest of South Africa, the Orange Free State, Natal, the Transvaal, the other three major provinces there. And of course, the English felt, well, you know, what we really need to do is get the Boers to come onto our side. What we need to do is, perhaps if we had a common enemy, if we had a common enemy, then maybe the Boers would join with us, and then we could begin to bring them into our circle of influence and control. Well, where were we going to get a common enemy? Well, there were the Zulus. They'd been living in peace over on the eastern shores of Africa in what's known as Zululand and Natal for the last 30 years, no incidents at all. But they wanted a war. So they made a series of impossible demands on the king of the Zulu nation, a man named Cetshwayo. Very, very similar to the demands that George W. Bush made on the Taliban immediately after September 11th, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But they made impossible demands on Cetshwayo. There's no way he could abide by all of these. So the British put together an army under General Chelmsford, and they marched off to Zululand, of course, and they rounded up a lot of the Boer farmers and said, you know, the Zulus are a real threat. You know, they're a threat to the world. They're going to launch their weapons of mass destruction. Well, they didn't say that, but the whole idea was they're a threat to you. You've got to join together with us in this common battle against the common enemy, who is Cetshwayo and the Zulus. There were about 5,000 men in the British contingent, and with the Boers that went along there, along with them. And they marched across the Buffalo River, which separated Natal from Zululand, and they left about 100 men at a trading station there, an abandoned trading station, a place called Rorke's Drift. They established a hospital there. They had a certain number of people who'd come down sick in the long trek across the South Africa, and there were a dozen, perhaps dozen and a half of people there in the hospital. And then, of course, Chelmsford moved his army off into Zululand. The idea was, of course, that the Zulus would be infuriated because they were there, would attack them. They would kill all the Zulus, and then they could win the war, and a wonderful victory for the Queen. So he decided he would leapfrog his army, and he would take and leave half of it at a place called Sandalwana and move the other half forward. Because he didn't want to have it all stretched out for a long distance. He realized that once he had his men together, they would become impenetrable. There'd be no way that, of course, they could be defeated by the Zulus. So he left half of his army at Sandalwana, moved the other half of the army forward. Now, at Sandalwana, there were 950 whites. There were 6 companies of the Queen's finest infantry, and the ranks had never been broken. And, of course, there were about 850 black Natals. They were mounted, who had sworn allegiance to the king. And the commander decided that he would actually send scouts out so they wouldn't be surprised. They sent scouts north, south, and to the east looking for the Zulus. Initially, there no sign of them. And then one of the scouts saw them coming like locusts. 20,000 blacks. And they weren't marching towards the Sandalwana, they were running. What the British didn't understand was the tradition of the Zulu. The Zulu was raised to be a warrior. And the tradition was that if you were to be a warrior, you could not sleep with a woman until you'd washed your spear in the blood of an enemy. It was known as the washing of the spear. It was the tradition with the Zulu. And you had the Zulus who were 50 years old who could never marry, because they had never washed their spear in the blood of an enemy. Well, of course, the English set out their ranks, the 6 companies, the infantry. You remember, they had one group kneeling and one group standing and alternating. And they thought this was going to be great fun, these Kaffirs, attacking them. After all they had was spears and a sword and a shield. At the end of the day, there were 50 living whites. And, of course, all the blacks had disappeared. 300 of them, most of them had been killed. 300 of them did escape. They galloped across the Buffalo River and shouted to the people at Rorke's Drift, "They're coming. They're coming." Well, at Rorke's Drift, there are 100 men. They've got a dozen and a half people in the hospital. They can't very well abandon it. They don't know what to do. All their supplies are there. And, of course, they realize that the army of the Sandalwana has been slaughtered. And so they waited, and then they came. They could hear them beforehand, 5,000. There were 5,000 Zulus who descended on Rorke's Drift. And, of course, the story is an amazing story because they came in waves. I mean, they got into the hospital, and they started to kill the people in the hospital. They got onto the roof of the building. They set it on fire. They broke through the ranks time and time again. But they held. At the end of the day, there were 87 living whites, most of them wounded, or many of them wounded. And the blacks withdrew. But of course, that was night, and they were waiting for the attack to come the next morning. Well, I'll tell you the rest of that story a little later, because I want to get you into the next war. I mentioned in 1891, Cecil Rhodes created the secret society to bring about the world government. How do I know about it? Because I've got books written by the people who were part of the secret society. And why don't you know about it, the average individual? Because they control what you think. Because they set out many years ago to gain control of our universities, of our schools, of our media. And people never talk about the secret society that was created by Cecil Rhodes to gain control of the world. Now, by 1898, there were here in the United States many people who had embraced this idea of empire for America. America should lead the world, this wonderful new Atlantis. One of them was Andrew Carnegie, one of the richest men in the world at that time. Another one was William Randolph Hearst, who owned the Hearst newspapers. And so they began drumming up support for the idea of America going to war. America was going to go to war with Spain. Well, Spain, they had the Philippines. They didn't have much of an empire. They had Puerto Rico. They had Cuba. But of course, the media kept talking about atrocity. Oh, they love atrocity stories. Terrible atrocities. We got to go to war with Spain. And then, for some unknown reason, why the Navy sent the battleship Maine into the harbor at Havana when their feelings between Spain and America are really heightened. And one night, while anchored there, why there's a great explosion and the Maine goes down with a number of men aboard. Well, immediately the press took up the cry, the Spanish sunk the Maine, remember the Maine, and of course they claimed that the Spanish sunk it with a sea mine, and immediately there was a demand for war, and war was declared on Spain. It wasn't much of a war. It lasted long enough for Teddy Roosevelt to lead the charge up San Juan Hill and for Admiral Dewey to go over to the Philippines and sink the Spanish fleet in Manila Harbor. I remember when I went to college, they taught us a little ditty. Oh, Dewey was that morning upon that month in May, and Dewey was the admiral down in Manila Bay, and Dewey were the regent's eyes, them six of oral blue, but do we feel discouraged? I do not think we do. Well, the war lasted for 3 months after that. That was the end of the Spanish-American War. But America was on its way towards empire. And if you have a Bartlett's quotation, look up William Randolph Hearst. There's only one quotation from him there. His cable he sent to a man named Frederick Remington in Cuba saying, "You supply the pictures, I'll supply the war." Well, years later, when the battleship Maine was raised and Admiral Rickover of American Naval Flame actually evaluated it, there was no external explosion. Why? Of course, the explosion was in the coal bunker, and that set off the place where the munitions were stored. There was no reason for the war at all. It was totally contrived. But America was on its path to empire. Well, the next war did not affect us primarily, although its impact is tremendous here, because people really don't understand the Boer War. It was fought between 1899 and 1902. It was actually created by Cecil Rhodes and his secret society. And if you get my video that they have here, The Secrets of the Illuminati, we talk a lot more about that. The man in charge, the High Commissioner in the Cape Province, was a man named Lord Milner, who was one of the 4 original members of Cecil Rhodes' secret society. And this secret society by then, of course, dominated the British government, and they dominated the newspapers in South Africa, and they precipitated a war. And everybody said, this is going to be a simple little war. They called it Milner's Tea Time War. Our boys will be home by Christmas. Well, 3 bloody years later, 100,000 British casualties later, the war came to an end, not because they defeated the Boers, but because they'd arrested the women and children and put them into concentration camps, and they got typhus and typhoid. And of course, they died, and 28,000 of them died. And when that word got back to Great Britain, why there was such an outcry that they demanded the war come to an end. But you see, this was beginning to consolidate the British Empire. And now, of course, you had the Union of South Africa, first step along the way to consolidating the world. This idea of a new world order, a new world religion. They got away with the First World War, with the Boer War, so they decided they were going to create another war. And the whole idea was, out of war, you change societies. Now, how can I make that statement? Well, if you read the autobiography of Bertrand Russell, the first volume, from 1872 to 1914 on page 153, he will tell you that sometime before 1905, before Sir Edward Grey became the Foreign Minister of England, he was attending a meeting of a little dinner group called the Coefficients. And they met on a regular basis. It was made up of the people who controlled the finances, the aristocracy of Great Britain, and the socialists. People like Sidney Webb, Bertrand Russell, George Bernard Shaw. The leaders of the Fabian socialist movement were all there. And they were discussing, various and sundry things. Bertrand Russell says that one evening why Sir Edward Grey got up and laid out a plan for alliances in Europe, and he said, I got to my feet and I said, you're laying out the plan for a war in Europe. This is wrong. But he said, nobody there was concerned. And he said, I resigned from the group. I was the first person to speak out against the First World War. And that would have been about 1905. Then, of course, if you go into the story of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, in the secret government 4-tape set, I have my interview with Norman Dodd, and I know that the Prophecy Club used to offer these tapes, and I hope that they still do. You need to hear my interview with Norman Dodd, where he tells how he was the director of research for the Reese Committee, commissioned by the 83rd Congress to investigate the great tax-exempt foundations to find out why they were financing communism and socialism, because that didn't make sense. And he sent one of his investigators over to go through the papers of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and she found out that in 1908, before the Carnegie Endowment was ever actually certified, was ever incorporated, the leaders of this board of the Carnegie Endowment were trying to determine how to change the world. And they said the best way to change the world is war. And then from 1909 to 1910, they spent their time trying to figure out how to bring about a great world war. Here is the lead page of the Journal of American History, 1908. And we have copies of this. I have a copy here in the back of my syllabus, and if any of you want it, you can get it from my ministry. And in that it says a great war is coming. And when that war ends, we will have the United Nations. Of course, it turned out they were going to have the League of Nations, but they talked in this about the United Nations. In 1908, it was all planned long ahead of time. And all those men who fought and bled and suffered and died in that great war, of course, died for nothing. Of course, to get America into the war, first of all, they had to have an incident. That was to be the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a British ship of war that carried passengers. Why would you carry passengers on a British ship of war? To create an incident. And the Germans kept trying to publish articles in our newspaper saying to Americans, don't go on the Lusitania, it's a ship of war and it's going to be sunk. And the State Department told the Americans, you got nothing to worry about. Go ahead, that's just fear tactics, nothing to worry about. And so the Lusitania was sent into a war zone. The destroyer escort, which had been promised, was withdrawn. The captain was told to go into an area where they knew there were German submarines, the sinking British ships the day before, at 2/3 speed to save coal. And when the ship went down, 900 lives were lost. And they had a wonderful slogan. It was, remember the Lusitania. Well over 100 Americans were among the people who lost their lives. But you see, there are people who really have no concern over human life. It all has to do with bringing about these horrible conflicts, because they had to get America into the First World War, because they hoped then we would lead the world into this world government that these people hoped to establish. And when the League of Nations failed, why, a Second World War became inevitable. Colonel House, writing in Foreign Affairs magazine in 1923, said this: if war had not come in 1914 in fierce and exaggerated form, the idea of an association of nations would probably have remained dormant, for great reforms seldom materialize except during great upheaval. Let me read that again. If war had not come in 1914 in fierce and exaggerated form, the idea of an association of nations would probably have remained dormant, for great reforms seldom materialized except during great upheaval. For great reforms seldom materialized during great upheaval. And ladies and gentlemen, we're looking at great upheaval today as we see what's unfolding in the Mideast. And if the administration is successful in plunging us into a war with Iraq, believe me, it will not end with Iraq. For as a meeting that was held during this past week at the Arab League, and one of the leaders said, you're opening the gates of hell and you do not know what will happen. Well, I believe that some people do know what was happen, but certainly not what the average American wants to happen. Well, they needed a Second World War. How are they going to get a Second World War? Ted Flynn's book, Hope of the World, Hope of the Wicked, the Master Plan to Rule the World. He simply goes into the fact that we financed Adolf Hitler. Now, that's pretty hard for the average American to believe. Wicked Adolf Hitler. But, of course, if you go into the background, of course, our corporations actually supplied the war materials. We gave them the ability to manufacture ethyl gasoline for their aircraft. My book, Brotherhood of Darkness, goes into great detail on how we financed Adolf Hitler. This is a letter that I found among Colonel House's papers at Yale University when I was there in New Haven some years ago. It's dated October 29, 1936. And on page 2 of this, he goes in and he says, why are American corporations building the war materials for the Germans? We just got through with the war. Nobody wants another war. So why are American corporations building the war materials when they can't make a profit? They can't get any money out of the country because of exchange restrictions. We created Adolf Hitler. In fact, we not only created Adolf Hitler, but we prolonged the war intentionally. And of course, our banks were working and helping to finance Hitler during much of the war. And you need to read the books, also Ruled by Secrecy by Jim Marrs. Excellent book, going into how our banks were working right along to create the best enemy that money could buy. A terrible and bloody war with over 40 million people dead. Horrible carnage. Once again, the world was transformed in a created war. And if you doubt that Hitler was encouraged at every turn, you need to get Professor Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, and found out how the little group, which was the extension of Cecil Rhodes' original secret society, by this time it was known as the Cliveden Set in England, was encouraging Hitler at every turn and telling him to go ahead and take the Rhineland, go ahead and take Africa, Austria, go ahead and take the Sudetenland. And of course, when you hear that Chamberlain was appeasing, Chamberlain wasn't appeasing. Chamberlain was doing what he was supposed to do, and that was encouraging Adolf Hitler, the best enemy that money could buy. How did they get America into World War II? Well, of course, Pearl Harbor was so contrived. First of all, America had put an embargo on China, on the Japanese, so they couldn't buy raw materials anywhere in the world. Japan didn't have any war materials. They didn't have any raw materials, so there was no way that they could have an industrialized society. And we cut them off from money, we cut them off from raw materials, and then we cut them off from oil. What do you think would happen to the United States if we had no oil reserves and somebody cut us off from oil completely and we couldn't get it from anywhere in the world? How long would this country last? That was the position Japan was in. We knew it was going to lead to war. Now, you've probably heard we had no idea where the Japanese fleet was. Well, actually, I've interviewed Robert Stinnett and John Toland. We knew exactly where the Japanese fleet was. Do you realize that to this very day, much of the information surrounding what happened at Pearl Harbor is still classified? Do you honestly think we're trying to keep the Japanese from finding out what we knew before the attack on Pearl Harbor? No. We want to keep the American people from knowing what we knew before Pearl Harbor. Back at Yale University, the Sterling Library, where Colonel House's papers are, is also the diary of Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who just happened to be a member of Skull and Bones. And in that diary, he talked about how, the only question was how we were going to get into the war and get the Japanese to fire the first shot. It was a setup. We knew the war was coming. We knew when it was coming. We knew when the attack was coming, and we left those 2,800 boys to die at Pearl Harbor. And if you have not read the books, The Day of Deceit or John Toland's or the other material on this, you need to find out. You need to understand there really are evil and wicked people out there. And sometimes they're operating at the highest levels of our government. Now, the Japanese surrendered then, August 19th, 1945. We have the article out of the Chicago Tribune. Did you know that the Japanese had tried 5 times before to surrender during the previous 6 months? Part of this was confirmed to me when I spent some time with General Albert Wedemeyer. But this is laid out in this article in the Chicago Tribune. They had offered to surrender, and we wouldn't accept their surrender. We went ahead and invaded Okinawa, and then Iwo Jima, all totally unnecessary. We've dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, totally unnecessarily. But then one of those 2 cities was the most Christianized nation in all of Japan. Operation Keelhaul. I wonder how many of you know what Operation Keelhaul is. How many of you, is there anybody here who's not heard of the Holocaust and the 6 million Jews who died in the concentration camps? But how many of you heard about Operation Keelhaul and the 6 million Russians that the United States and Canada and England and the Allies in Europe sent back to Russia to be killed at the end of the Second World War? Operation Keelhaul, there are a number of books written about it. One of them is The East Came West, another is Secret Betrayal, another one is Operation Keelhaul. Now, they're all out of print. They're difficult to get. You're going to have to get somebody to research them and get them. Julius Epstein's Operation Keelhole, wonderful book, Secret Betrayal by Tolstoy. This is Count Tolstoy's nephew. But you're not going to hear about this. What this was we rounded up the prisoners we had. There were Russians who defected to the Nazis or who'd been captured by the Nazis, and we were holding as prisoners, and we sent them back. And a third of them were immediately executed. A third were sent off to die in Siberia, and a third of them could never get a job but were kept there in Russia as a constant reminder to anybody else who ever thought about defecting from Russia, to realization that the West would always send them back again. There is no escape. Sort of like Elian Gonzalez, the whole idea of Elian Gonzalez. You know, the West will always cooperate. How could they conceal something of that magnitude from the American people? Operation Keelhaul. Get the material, understand the media in America is controlled. The fall of Eastern Europe, literally every woman in Eastern Europe was raped. They took the men who could work and sent them off to Russia, where many of them died, and working in the camps there, working in the factories. They took all of the manufacturing, all the plants, and they sent them off to Russia. And of course, we financed the whole thing. Wonderful book from Major Jordan's diary points out that we had actually given the Russians the plates for our occupation money, so they could print our occupation money and we would redeem it, and that way we could finance the Russian occupation of Eastern Europe. The fall of China. Did anybody ever wonder how it was that the communists took over China? This is the report of the Institute of Pacific Relations. Any of you want this is a summary of it, and we actually have their summary, in which they tell how it came about. The United States State Department put an arms embargo on General Chiang Kai-shek, so the nationalist Chinese could not buy weapons anywhere in the world. They couldn't even get the weapons they'd already bought and paid for on Okinawa and other Pacific islands, and they had no weapons to fight with. Well, Congress was very upset about this, and they appropriated $125 million, and they even sent General Albert Wedemeyer over to China to see what could be done to save China from going communist. And the United States State Department, under the control of members of the Council on Foreign Relations at the time, loaded the ships up, kept them in harbor in San Francisco and Los Angeles for a year and a half. And then when the ships were finally allowed to sail to China, when it was too late to do anything, and when they arrived, they opened up the cases of rifles, and they didn't have any bolts in them, and they were useless. We brought communism to China, but you can't let the American people know that, because they promptly killed about 80 million people, and that's just too horrible for us to think about. It might make us feel a little uneasy. People have forgotten that men and women become accomplices to the evils they fail to oppose. I wonder how many of you have heard of the Great Hunger, 1961, 1962 in China. Two books, The Great Hunger, The Hungry Ghosts, or you can get the information from Population Research. My friend Stephen Mosier was actually in China after he was the first American to live in the Chinese community. And of course, he was the one who told about how when the one-child policy came in, how they were killing the girl children in China so they could have a son. But he knew many of the survivors of this great hunger. 44.5 million Chinese were intentionally starved to death in 61 and 62. How could you keep that from the American people? Why, you simply control the media, and no one will ever hear about it. The books, The Hungry Ghosts, and of course, The Great Hunger. Well, then of course we have the Korean War. After China had gone communist and Eastern Europe had gone communist, there were a lot of Americans who said, we got to have communists working there in the State Department. I mean, there got to be communists behind this. And so, well, how do you convince people that we don't have communists working in government? Why, we go to war with communism. And so Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and this story is told in MacArthur's book, Reminiscences. It's out of print. You can probably get it at a used bookstore or by a search. Well worthwhile reading. Secretary of State Dean Acheson gives a speech to the press club, and he says, if South Korea is attacked, we will not defend it. And then the Joint Chiefs of Staff come up with a similar statement, and old Kim Il-sung up in North Korea, dictator in North Korea, he's not very smart. He's not smarter than Saddam Hussein is, or the Taliban, and so he thinks that he can safely invade South Korea, which he does. And of course, immediately we're in war, a no-win war in Korea. If you read MacArthur's Reminiscences, you'll find that the United States Navy put the 7th Fleet between Formosa and the mainland, not to protect Formosa from the Chinese communists, but to protect the Chinese communists from the forces, the military forces on Formosa, which allowed the Chinese communists then to take a 1 million-man army and move it up into Manchuria to come down and kill our boys in North Korea. Now, how did the Chinese communists know we wouldn't pull the 7th Fleet out and leave their coast unarmed, unprotected? If you read MacArthur's reminiscences, he quotes General Lin Piao, who commanded the forces that killed our boys in North Korea, as saying, "I would never risk my troops and my military reputation and cross the Yalu if I had not been guaranteed that Washington would restrain General MacArthur from taking retaliation against me." But you see, General MacArthur didn't know that. And then, of course, we get into Vietnam, and what is Vietnam? It's another no-win war. How did we get into it? It was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The trouble is that it never took place. Admiral Stockdale flew over that in his book, In Love and War. He was flying over there. He said there were no torpedo boats there. It was simply our destroyers firing off into the Black Sea. And then recently, of course, there's been the released tapes of the White House conversations and what happened there, and Lyndon Johnson screaming at Robert McNamara, "You lied to me, there was no Gulf of Tonkin incident, and 58,000 American boys died for absolutely nothing because we never tried to win the war." Vietnam was never fought to defeat communism because all during the Vietnam War we were financing, the Russians were financing the North Vietnamese. We weren't allowed to bomb the railways leading from Haiphong. We weren't allowed to mine the harbor. We weren't allowed to sink a boat as the French had done in the harbor at Haiphong and cut off their supplies. We couldn't bomb the hydroelectric plants or bomb the dikes and ended the war. I talked personally to William H. Sullivan, the American ambassador there, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He said, "I never understood why we didn't win the war." I interviewed General Lewis Walt, who commanded the Marines in the Northern Division there in I Corps. He said, "Well, we could have won the war in 2 months. We were never allowed to win the war." Vietnam was fought not to defeat communism, but to change America. Because during that period of time, why, they took God out of our schools and prayer out of our schools. And the 10 Commandments, well, leaving the basis for taking the 10 Commandments, that wasn't until 1980. We got Roe versus Wade, legalized abortion. And even something more important for what we're talking about today, we got the repeal of the McCarran Immigration Act and beginning to bring large numbers of Muslims, who one day, of course, will be used for another purpose in this country, into the United States. Desert Storm, well, Desert Storm was another example of how you contrive a war. You have to remember that Saddam Hussein had been our man. Saddam Hussein, he came to power in July of 1979. And immediately we began to finance him. We backed him when he was using poison gas on his own countrymen, the Kurds. Somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 Kurds were killed by Saddam Hussein. We backed him when he used poison gas against the Iranians during the Iran-Iraq war. We financed him, gave him large amounts of money. We even gave him the chemical and biological material to create the weapons that we're so concerned about now. The book is called Against All Enemies by Seymour Hersh, or you can get the Regal report by Senator Regal. Of course, it cost him his position in the Senate because he did investigation and brought out the truth about how we'd created Saddam Hussein and financed Saddam Hussein and helped Saddam Hussein, why he lost his position in the Senate. We can't have senators there who tell the truth. But then, of course, in 1990, why there was a disagreement between Saddam Hussein and the government of Kuwait. They were stealing oil out of one of his oil fields. They were transfers drilling. And so we asked our ambassador, April Glaspie, whether or not we would object to his invading Kuwait, and she said, of course not. And the State Department said essentially the same thing, or some of their officials on the radio and public statements. And of course, Saddam Hussein wasn't any smarter than Kim Il-sung. He invaded Kuwait, and now we had a war going. That's what Kuwait was. Desert Storm was all about. And of course, the great tragedy was that at the end of the war, when the wicked Saddam Hussein could have been removed from power, we didn't do it. We left him in power. Why would we do something that stupid? And now we want to go to war to get rid of Saddam Hussein? Well, the next thing I want to do is I want to tell you about the contrived conflict that we face today. Well, there are two personalities I'd like to start out with that will perhaps give you some insight into why I am concerned about the contrived conflict. The first one was a man named Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman. And Sheikh Rahman, first of all, was involved with the assassination of Anwar Sadat back in 1982. And then, of course, from 85 to 91, he was helping the Central Intelligence Agency to recruit Muslims from Egypt, where he lived, and the surrounding areas, to go to Afghanistan to fight in the war there, in the Afghan war. And then, of course, he keeps getting arrested by the Egyptian government because he's really advocating revolution, and he keeps getting out of jail. And this is covered in a wonderful book called Unholy Wars by John Cooley. And then in 1991, why we're helping this man who was openly advocating terrorism to come to the United States. The CIA helps him to come to the United States. And he goes to live then in New York. His right-hand man is a FBI informant named Salem, S-A-L-E-M. And Mr. Salem is, of course, agitating among this small group of Islamic radicals who surround Sheikh Rahman to start blowing up things in New York. He's an agent provocateur. And he finally gets enough support where they're talking about blowing up the World Trade Center. Well, he gets a little upset about this time, and they're going to bring in experts from overseas to blow up the World Trade Center. He goes to the FBI, and he tells them, they're going to blow up the World Trade Center, and I'm supposed to help build the bomb. I want you to provide me powder that won't explode because I don't want anybody to get hurt. And what does the FBI do, knowing that they're going to blow up the World Trade Center? This is 1993, remember. Knowing that they've got the man who's going to build the bomb, they fire him. And they do absolutely nothing. Now, this is the most incredible story. You'll find it in Time magazine, the New York Times, October 28, 1990, and that should be 1993, page A2, not 1990. It's October 28, 1993, page A2. I'm sorry, that should be page A1. It's on the front page. It was written by Mr. Blumenthal. Actually, a friend of mine contacted Mr. Blumenthal and asked him about the story. And Mr. Blumenthal said, I'm not allowed to talk about it. Well, think of the implications. The FBI knew they were going to blow up the building. They allowed it to happen. 6 people were killed, 1,000 were injured, $250 million damage was done. Now, it could have been far worse. It was planned initially by Ramzi Yousef, who was the master bomb builder who came to the United States, that they were going to topple one tower against the other tower, bring them both down and kill 250,000 people. That was the plan. Fortunately, it failed. But what is most frightening to me is the fact that the FBI had advanced knowledge and they did nothing to stop it. What does that suggest to you? And then, of course, the second personality is Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. He planned the assassination of Anwar Sadat. He was involved with it. He was tried and convicted in absentia in Egypt, and they have an outstanding warrant for his arrest. From 1982 to 1997, he lived in Switzerland. He coordinated the terrorist activities and the terrorist movement in Europe. And this is covered in a book called Bin Laden, the Man Who Declared War Against America by Joseph Bodansky. Now, Joseph Bodansky is not simply a casual player. He is the chairman of the Congressional Task Force on Terrorism and Unconventional Warfare, and I think he speaks with a great deal of authority because he has access to a great deal of information you and I wouldn't. In 1993, Dr. al-Zawahiri, along with Osama bin Laden, planned the ambush of the American forces in Somalia. Remember, we talked earlier about Black Hawk Down. It was an ambush. It was set up ahead of time. They actually had brought in people from all over the Muslim world. They brought in the grenade launchers. And, of course, if you remember the movie, why everybody's rushing to the Olympic Hotel, because this is where the battle is going to be that's going to drive America out of Somalia. And it worked. It was financed by Osama bin Laden. It was planned by Dr. al-Zawahiri. In 1995, he is appointed head of all terrorist activities in the United States, and that very year, your State Department allowed him to come to the United States and tour this country, raising funds and recruiting terrorists for their movement. And that's covered in the New York Times, October 23rd, 2001, page B4. And if you want any of these, you can contact me. We'll give you the actual clippings because we have them all. In 1996, Iran appointed bin Laden and al-Zawahiri to be the leaders of the worldwide terrorist movement, because you must understand that Iran and Saudi Arabia are the two major sources of world terrorism and the two major financiers of world terrorism. And you keep hearing about the conflict between the Sunni Muslims and the Shiite Muslims, and this is simply all to make you confused. They're working together because they have a common enemy. That is America and the Christian West. And then, of course, in 1997, this fellow's working with the CIA, and they've got some sort of agreements going on that, the Muslims who are Al-Qaeda Muslims who are in Bosnia will not attack American troops, and we will allow them to go ahead and try to overthrow the Egyptian government at that time. And this is all covered in Bodansky's book. Now, why would the CIA be simply negotiating with this man who was involved with the murder of our boys in Somalia and in charge of terrorism in the United States? There are just so many unanswered questions. They really don't quite make sense. In fact, there are many people think that al-Zawahiri was the mastermind behind the 9/11 attack. If you ever see the pictures of Osama bin Laden, you will see pictures usually in the magazines of Dr. al-Zawahiri right along beside him. And amazingly enough, both he and Osama bin Laden appear to have been able to escape the tragedy or the destruction that occurred in Afghanistan. So let's get into the timeline of terror to understand where it all began. Where did it really begin? Well, it really began during the Vietnam War in 1965 in the United States when they repealed the McCarran Immigration Act to begin to bring large numbers of Muslims into the United States. Before that, there were only a few thousand Muslims living in the United States. But the whole purpose of the changing of the Immigration Act was to convert us from a Christian nation into a multicultural nation, and to bring in people of different nations and different religions and different languages. Now, we know this is done intentionally because we have organizations for illegal aliens, and they're funded by the Ford Foundation. And they actually have organizations funded to defend people who are here in violation of our laws. Furthermore, when Senator Hayakawa tried to have English declared the official language of the United States, why, of course, there was tremendous opposition put up. Why? Because they don't want one language to bond us together. They want separate languages so that we can be separated. And then, of course, by bringing in large numbers of people into this country of the Muslim extraction, you're bringing people in who believe that they will immediately go to paradise if they die killing infidels, and that's you and me. I don't know how many of you saw the 60-minute presentation this last weekend. That would have been the 1st of September of the year 2002. And on that date, Maury Safer was interviewing 4 attractive Muslim girls. They were probably about 18 years old. They were seniors in a Muslim high school in Chicago. And they all agreed that, of course, what was going on in Israel, the terrorist attacks, Muslims blowing themselves up, killing Jews, was perfectly acceptable. And this one little girl said, why, if I were to go onto a naval base and blow myself up, why, I would go immediately to paradise. And then, of course, apparently this was, of course, filmed a few weeks later. Somebody said, do you realize what you've said? And she contacted CBS and she said, I really meant if I went onto an Israeli naval base and blew myself up, I would go to paradise. Well, how many naval bases does Israel have? Do you honestly think she was talking about an Israeli naval base? No, you must understand there's a different outlook, a different worldview. I mean, not all Muslims are violent, are of this radical form, but let me tell you that if you are a Muslim living in Palestine today and you don't want to kill Israelis, they will kill you. The other Muslims will kill you. And this is happening within this last couple of weeks. Articles are repeatedly in the New York Times talking about this sort of a situation. And people don't understand that we have within America all sorts of sleeper cells. They've been set up here for many, many years, waiting for the word to be given. How do we know that? Well, I'm going to tell you in just a few minutes. In 1979 was the next major date. That was the year, in February, the Ayatollah Khomeini came to power in Iran. The Shah of Iran had the 6th largest military in the world. He was a steadfast friend of America. He was a tyrant, as most of the people we put in power are. But why would we topple a friend of the United States and bring an enemy to power? We brought the Ayatollah Khomeini to power. There's no question. You study that era. And at the time, it just didn't make sense. Why would we do anything that stupid? But then in 1979, I didn't understand really the degree of evil that we face today. So we established the Ayatollah Khomeini to power and the radical Iranian Ayatollahs there. And then, of course, in July, Saddam Hussein seized power in Iraq. In July, that same month, we began to finance the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Now, this is important because in July of 1979, the Soviets had not yet invaded the country. We began financing the Mujahideen because there was a pro-communist government in Afghanistan, knowing full well that if we financed the Mujahideen, the Soviets would invade. That was how we were going to get a war going. How can I make that statement? Well, the man who was in charge of our foreign policy was a man named Zbigniew Brzezinski. You remember Zbigniew Brzezinski, the man who was commissioned by David Rockefeller to actually create the Trilateral Commission, and of course their emblem is three intertwining sixes, that's their logo. And Brzezinski, actually 10 years after this occurred, about 1989, told a French news television reporter and on film that he had told Jimmy Carter that if we financed the Mujahideen, the Soviets would invade. That is covered in a book called Unholy Wars by John Cooley. So you need to get the information and understand, again, that a year, why in December, why the Soviets did invade, and now we had a war, a wonderful war that we could get America involved in. Of course, it was a CIA war where America, the CIA, the Pakistans, and the Saudis brought Muslims from all over the world to indoctrinate them in the radical form of Islam. It's called Wahhabism, to engage in a holy war against the infidels, the Soviets, to establish the Holy Land of Afghanistan as the first truly Muslim state in the world, where men, of course, were worshipped by Allah, and Allah gave them the victory. And they really believed that Allah gave them the victory. And, of course, then this began to mold the al-Qaeda around Osama bin Laden. Now, we'll get into Osama very soon. Of course, that same year, 1979, why there was a revolt, there was a military dictatorship was established in Pakistan, and they hung the duly elected leader. And, of course, we went right along with the new military dictatorship. So much for democracy. From 1980 to 1989, why the Central Intelligence Agency brought Muslims from all over the world to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets in this holy war. Of course, at that time, Osama bin Laden had gone there. He began working with the CIA, and of course, we gave them Stinger missiles. We encouraged them. Oh, it's so difficult for people to understand that we would actually create the best enemy that money could buy, but that's exactly what we did. From 1981 to 1985, the Iranians actually had a base in Iran where they were training people, terrorists, how to hijack American planes and crash them into buildings. They had 747, they had 707 there. They were actually training hijackers how to hijack our planes. How do we know that? Well, there's a book called Target America in the West. It was written in 1993 by Joseph Bodansky, who was the director of the Congressional Task Force on Terrorism and Unconventional Warfare, a book almost impossible to get. The quotations you can find in Dr. Cuddy's book. I have a copy. I had to get it out of Great Britain. I couldn't find one in the United States. It was for sale. So certain books are suppressed. You will actually find this, though, if you want to check it out, in the September 24th, 2001 issue of New Yorker magazine, where they quote Joseph Bodansky making this statement, that Iran was training in the early 1980s to hijack our planes and crash them in the buildings. So much for Vice President Cheney's statement the Sunday after the 9/11 attack. This unspeakable thing, why we just had no idea this could happen. Well, of course, you had the Iran-Iraq war from 1981 to 1988. We financed both sides. We financed the Iraqis. We financed and aided and armed the Iranians. We called it arms for hostages or something absurd at the start. But it's how you really create chaos, and a lot of people killed. You finance both sides, or you arm both sides of the war. One of the most interesting parts of the whole story is 1985 and thereafter. USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, goes into Afghanistan, and of course we set up schools. And we bring in textbooks because who can be against education? And these textbooks tell the young Muslim boys who are being trained in the schools about how wonderful it is to die for Allah, how wonderful it is to kill the infidels. And they teach them mathematics. 2 bullets, 3 rifles, and 4 landmines is how many weapons? I mean, these articles come out in the Washington Post. Here's one of the references to it, March 23rd, 2002, page 1. Why would we do something stupid like that? Well, they said, well, if we didn't have about Islam in there, the teachers wouldn't use the books. Well, we're still doing it. And after peace was declared, after we'd killed so many of the young people who were indoctrinated in the mid-'80s with these ideas of radical Islam who joined the Taliban, why, of course, within the last year, we've gone back in with our textbooks. 2 bullets, 3 rifles, 4 landmines is how many weapons? Isn't it wonderful to die for Allah and to kill the infidels? And when it was pointed out that you're not supposed to spend American money to push religion, they said, well, this really isn't religion. After all, education is a secular activity. In 1987, 1988, I've interviewed Michael Springman. He was in charge of issuing visas in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And there were a lot of people trying to come into the United States from Saudi Arabia that didn't have any business coming in. They'd come in from other countries and try to get a visa there. He didn't want to give them visas because they had no business coming here. He was ordered to give them visas to come to the United States. And he got into all sorts of trouble. The CIA ordered him. He said 1/3 of the people working in his office were CIA. And it wasn't until he got back to the United States he was told, well, those were all terrorists they wanted to bring here. They were bringing the United States to train these terrorists. Michael Springman. Then in 1988, Sheikh Abdul Azam came to the United States, and he was organizing terrorist cells here in the United States. He was the leader of this whole radical Islamic movement, and of course Osama bin Laden was sort of his disciple. Azam was the leader, and he was touring the United States. Now, if those of you who have not read Stephen Emerson's wonderful book, The American Jihad, or seen his video, A Jihad in America, that came out in 1994, you really need to get it, because you'll see pictures of Azam actually talking about, how we have to kill jihad and chop off hands and feet so Allah will have legs to stand on. There's got to be blood running in the streets. And this is what they were preaching in America back in 1988 and 1989. And of course, Osama bin Laden at that time was organizing the Al-Qaeda movement over in Afghanistan. You have to understand, Al-Qaeda was simply these Muslims that we had brought to Afghanistan to fight. And of course, they were organized then after the war to go back to their own countries to try to get democratic or representative governments. And the people wanted the Islamic government to let them have it. And we weren't about, of course, to allow that. And really, initially, the Al-Qaeda was not anti-American. It was only anti-American after we stationed our troops on the Holy Land of Saudi Arabia. 1990, why Saddam Hussein requested permission to invade Kuwait. We gave it to him, and of course that was one of the worst mistakes he ever made. And of course, in 1991, we fought the Gulf War. We gave Syria $1 billion. Syria is one of the major sources of Islamic terrorism in the world. I mean, they are a terrorist nation. They've always been cited as a terrorist nation by the State Department, and yet we gave them $1 billion. What's wrong with this picture? And then, of course, one of the most interesting parts of this whole story was told in Joseph Bodansky's book, Target America. He talked about the Islamic terrorist cells that were here in the United States, and Saddam wanted to mobilize these during the Gulf War. You remember he kept saying this is going to be the mother of all wars, and terrible things are going to happen to America. Well, he knew about the Islamic terrorist cells that were here, but they were really under the control of Iran and Saudi Arabia, and when he wanted to mobilize them, they wouldn't let him. Why would that be? Well, maybe things are not as they appear to be. That's in Joseph Bodansky's book, Target America. But you're never going to hear about those Islamic terrorist cells. They were here long before Al-Qaeda was ever here. Sleeper cells, waiting for when the word is given. Well, in 1991, Osama bin Laden is supposed to have criticized the Saudi government because that allowed the Americans to establish bases in Saudi Arabia. The infidels, the crusaders were on Holy Land, and so Osama bin Laden, of course, was forced to leave Saudi Arabia, and he goes off to the Sudan. He's over in the Sudan, and of course, there in 1993, he organizes the attack on our forces in Somalia, and he was, at least in some way, involved with the the bombing of the World Trade Center. Because the mastermind, and I mentioned his name only briefly, his name was Ramzi Youssef. Ramzi Youssef. Try to remember that name because he keeps turning up over and over again. Ramzi Youssef was sent to the United States to build the bomb that took out the World Trade Center in 1993. He left immediately after that. He goes over to the Philippines about shortly after Osama bin Laden goes over there. Osama bin Laden goes over to the Philippines in 1993 and begins to set up terrorist cells. One of them is an organization known as Abu Sayyaf. And you remember it was Abu Sayyaf that killed Greg Burnham here recently. Or he was killed. They'd taken the American hostages. What is so interesting about that is that Abu Sayyaf was actually organized, at least in part, by a man named Edwin Angeles. And Edwin Angeles just happened to be an agent of the Philippine government. So the Philippine government was instrumental in setting up Abu Sayyaf, which was a terrorist organization they were fighting. In fact, at one time, shortly after they captured the Burnhams, they were trapped in a hospital, surrounded by the Philippine military, and they just went out the back door and disappeared into the woods, into the jungles, and it just didn't quite make sense. Didn't quite make sense how you'd have this group that was able to just evade the entire Philippine military and then operate for so many years, unless you understand that it was organized by the Philippine government. But what a wonderful way, of course, to create one of the best enemies money could buy. Well, by 1993, the FBI discovered that the Holy Land Foundation in the United States was actually collecting money here and sending it to Hamas and Hezbollah and all of the terrorist organizations over in the Near East, and we didn't do anything about it. Osama bin Laden went to the Philippines to organize his terrorist groups. The Langley Air Force Base held a conference on terrorism, and they discussed using planes as weapons to attack the White House and the Pentagon, 1993. But of course, Vice President Cheney had never heard of any of these things, this unspeakable attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. 1994, Stephen Emerson had been studying this for several years, and he was a reporter. He put together this wonderful video. It's entitled Jihad in America. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but it really is outstanding. It was shown one time on PBS and then was suppressed. They could never get it shown on any major television station in America until recently. Maybe this last year it has been shown once or twice. How can you suppress programs in America today? Well, how could they suppress mention of Operation Keelhaul? How could they suppress mention of the Great Hunger in China when 44.5 million people were starved to death in 61 and 62? Why, you control what the American people think. That's why I do 5 hours of talk radio a day, to try to reach the American people, to let them see that they're not getting the truth. Well, it was in 1994 that a group of Islamic terrorists hijacked a plane in Algiers, and they flew it to Marseille. They released some of the prisoners in exchange for 27 tons of fuel, and when the gendarmes questioned the hostages, they said, well, they're going to take this plane, they're going to fly it up to Paris and crash it into the Eiffel Tower. So the gendarmes stormed the plane, and of course that was the end. But it was well known by 1994 they were going to use planes as weapons. That was the plan. And yet Vice President Cheney said, oh, this unspeakable act, this unspeakable act. It was 1994 when Osama bin Laden was stripped of his Saudi citizenship and supposedly disowned by his family. He bought a home in London, and of course then supposedly pressure was put on the British because he was of their relationship with the Saudis. He eventually went over to Libya, was involved in a murder there, at least according to the book, The Forbidden Truth, and then he returns back to Sudan. So we've got them moving, living in Sudan in 1994. The Futurist magazine in 1994 had an article that discussed terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center. The CIA and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan created the Taliban. And you'll find that mentioned in a book entitled Unholy Wars, and of course in the book Bin Laden, the man who declared war against America, and in a book called Dollars for Terror, we'll talk about a little bit later. And then, of course, we get to 1995, and we've got Terry Nichols. You remember Terry Nichols? He was the fellow who was convicted along with Timothy McVeigh. He was over there and accused, of course, of being involved in the World Trade Center, in the bombing of the Murrah building. Well, In 1994, he was over in the Philippines, and he was meeting with a fellow named Ramzi Youssef. Ramzi Youssef, who was the man who built the bomb that took out the World Trade Center on the first time around, and other members of the Philippine Al-Qaeda, people associated with Osama bin Laden's group. In January of 1995, Ramzi Youssef and a man named Murad are in their hotel room in the Philippines. They've already blown up one plane. Didn't do a very good job. They just killed one person, blew a hole in it. But they're trying to figure out how to blow up airplanes. So they're mixing up some of the bomb material in the sink, and I guess they added the wrong thing. They got a fire. They had to flee the hotel room. The police come in. The fire department comes in. And then they bring in the police, and they've got a laptop computer. So Ramzi Youssef, being the typical hero he is, sends Murad back to rescue the computer, because there are a lot of things on that computer they don't want people to know about. Number one, a plan to hijack 10 to 12 American jumbo jets and crash them, bomb them all out over the ocean. And something known as Operation Bajinka. Bajinka, a word meaning Big Bang, was a plan to hijack American planes and crash them into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, the White House, the Transamerica building in Chicago, and the Sears building in San Francisco. Now that comes off of Bill Kurtz's website, Bill Kurtz of the Washington Times. We know that there is a cover-up because immediately after the attack on the World Trade Center in September of last year, the Washington Times sent four reporters over to the Philippines to track down Operation Bajinka, and they came back to the United States and they wrote articles, and they said there really was a plan. They were going to hijack our planes, and they were going to crash them into the CIA building. And they totally changed it, you see, because they can't let the American people know that some people knew about a plan to fly planes into the World Trade Center. Okay. Well, then, of course, it was in 1995 that we have the World Trade Center bombing. I should mention that as soon as Ramzi Youssef had fled from the Philippines and Murad had been arrested in the Philippines, even though Terry Nichols had a round-trip ticket to the Philippines, he bought a one-way ticket back to the United States, and planning began for the Oklahoma City bombing. Now, the Oklahoma City bombing involved not only Terry Nichols and Fortier and Tim McVeigh, it involved a number of Islamic people, John Doe II, John Doe III, John Doe IV, who were all Islamic people. There were two people, Islamic people. They actually, as far as we can tell, were members of Saddam Hussein's Republic Guard. 3,500 to 5,000 had been brought to the United States by our government at the end of the Desert Storm and allowed to settle here, and they'd formed terrorist cells, at least according to Craig Roberts, all across America. And of course, John Doe II and John Doe III and John Doe IV all came from there. A woman named Jana Davis tracked down this whole story, tied it into Osama bin Laden, and of course into Iraq, but primarily into Osama bin Laden. And of course, since she could get no help at all from the FBI, they wouldn't even take her files, because they said, if we take these files, we'll have to turn them over to the Nichols and Timothy McVeigh defense, so we won't take your files. So she hired a fellow named David Shipperds, who had been the counsel for the House of Representatives when they impeached Bill Clinton. He wrote a book called Sellout. And he went to Washington, D.C. to try to get high government officials to look at the documentation of the fact that the Oklahoma City bombing involved Islamic people. And nobody there wanted to hear the story. They actively suppressed that. If you read Joseph Bodansky's book, Bin Laden, the Man Who Declared War Against America, you'll find that they took credit for it. But of course, the American people were never allowed to know that. Now, in 1995, Dr. al-Zawahiri was allowed to come to the United States and tour the country. Remember, he was the fellow who was in charge of terrorism in Europe and terrorism in the United States, and he was the fellow who had planned the assassination of Anwar Sadat. And there's a murder warrant out for him from Egypt, and we allow him to tour the United States. What's wrong with this picture? 1995, Osama bin Laden declared we should have guerrilla war on America. We should start killing Americans. Dr. al-Zawahiri tours the United States. 1996, Osama bin Laden and Dr. al-Zawahiri were placed in charge of international terrorism by the Iranians. They are the people who are going to lead this whole movement. At 1996, the government of the Sudan offered to turn Osama bin Laden over to the United States. And the Clinton administration, after duly considering it, decided not to take him. They approached us again. They said, we'll send him back to Saudi Arabia, and he'll be beheaded because, of course, he's been critical of the monarchy there, and he's been already involved in a bombing in Riyadh against the Saudis, and, of course, the bombing at the Khobar Towers. And the Saudis refused to take him. I wonder why. Or perhaps things are not exactly as we've been told. In 1996, the FBI agents visited 2 flight schools training Arabs because they already knew in 1996 that a number of Arabs were actually training here in the United States. An inordinate number of them were being trained as pilots here. 1996, the bombing of the Khobar Towers. 1996, the downing of TW-800. Now, despite the fact there were over 100 people who saw the missiles go up to hit the plane, your government officials insisted it was an explosion in the central fuel tank. But what's most interesting is, according to the book, Bin Laden, the Man Who Declared War on America, over in Europe, the Islamic radicals took credit for it. They put it in their papers. We did it. We did it. But, of course, the National Traffic Safety Board said, no, it was simply an explosion in the central fuel tank. Why? Because they didn't want you to know at that time everything is scripted, unfortunately. And, of course, the American people are to be the last to understand what the script really is. Osama bin Laden, of course, again declared war on America in 1997. The Taliban arrested Osama bin Laden. He's living there, and they offered to turn him over to Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi Arabians said, oh, we really don't want him. It was the same year in 1997 that Dr. al-Zawahiri was contacted by the CIA about the al-Qaeda troops. And we were, of course, backing the al-Qaeda troops in Bosnia. Didn't seem to bother us that they were, of course, Osama bin Laden's troops. In November of that year, the Islamists killed some 62 tourists in Luxor and wounded hundreds other there in a terrorist attack on defenseless people. 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a book. It was called The Grand Chessboard. And basically he said in that the American people, the multicultural society we have, will never rally behind our foreign policy unless, except in the circumstances of a truly massive and widely perceived direct external threat. The only way we're going to mobilize the American people in a multicultural society would be under the circumstances of a truly massive and widely perceived direct external threat. What does that sound like? What recent major event took place that was perceived as a direct external threat against America? 1998, Osama bin Laden comes forward and he calls for killing of Americans. 1998, why Libya issued and asked Interpol to come up with an arrest warrant for Osama bin Laden. Now, despite all the things Osama bin Laden has done, we've never asked Interpol to come up with an arrest warrant for him. Libya asked for it. Gaddafi asked for it because of this German that bin Laden had killed over there, in 1994. But our government has never asked for an arrest warrant for Osama bin Laden. Why is that? Our officials were negotiating with the Taliban for extradition of Osama bin Laden, of course, and then there was the bombing of the embassies in Africa, Dar es Salaam, and in Kenya. And, the 268 people killed, 5,000 wounded in those bombings. And so Bill Clinton starts lobbing cruise missiles into Afghanistan, and the Afghans says, look, you're going to start attacking our country. We're not going to negotiate with you to give you Osama bin Laden. And that was the end of that effort. It was that same year in 1998 that CIA and British Special Forces units trained and financed Osama bin Laden's KLA terrorists in Kosovo. And our Special Forces were actually training the KLA terrorists. Remember, they fought there, and we had that big debacle over in Kosovo at the time. 1999. Well, the CIA trained a group of 60 Pakistanis. They were supposed to go into Afghanistan and capture Osama bin Laden. Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, Southern California, was in touch with people over there. He found out exactly where Osama bin Laden was. He went to the administration and said, I know where he is. He's going to be there 2 weeks. You can get him. They weren't interested. Why would that be? After all, this is the wicked Osama bin Laden that we all know he's already been responsible for killing Americans at the Khobar Towers in Riyadh and in Somalia and the embassy bombings. And yet they weren't interested in finding out where he was or taking him out. Osama bin Laden was being tracked daily by people on the ground in Afghanistan who were hired by the Central Intelligence Agency. But of course, nothing much was done about that. In 1999, in September of 99, the Federal Research Division issued a report warning that Al-Qaeda could crash land with explosives planes into the Pentagon, the CIA, or the White House. The United States Commission on National Security for the 21st Century released the New World Coming report. And we actually have that, and we offer that to our ministry. That's this document. It came out over the name of ex-Senators Gary Hart and Warren Rudman. And of course, there were 14 people on the commission. About 12 of them came from the Council on Foreign Relations. Isn't that interesting? And of course, what it talks about is terrorism. We're going to have all sorts of terrorist attacks on America. They're coming. Now, this is 1999. They're coming out with this report, telling us about all the terrorist attacks. How many of you in 1999 really seriously believed we were going to have major terrorist attacks in America? You remember it was Gary Hart who, on September the 14th, addressed the Council on Foreign Relations and said there was a chance that President Bush can use this tragedy to bring about what his father had referred to, and I think only once, the New World Order. The President of the United States can use this tragedy. So they knew that the terrorist attacks were coming, but you see, the average American didn't. All of this is scripted. In fact, in that report on page 3, it says, history does not just happen, it is created. History does not just happen, it's created. Well, in the year 2000, the Phase 2 report comes out from the same commission talking about how we're going to have to restructure our government in face of terrorism. The Central Intelligence Agency, now that was the Phase 2 report, the Central Intelligence Agency financed the preparation of the Model State Emergency Health Powers Act, the most draconian legislation you've ever seen, and we have that. You may get it off the internet or you can get it through our ministry. And basically they talk for forced vaccination, forced quarantine, not quarantine because you're infected, because you're not infected and you won't take the vaccination, seizing your property, seizing your car, seizing your fuel, seizing your medicine, seizing everything you have in the name of protecting the public health. Osama bin Laden was being monitored in 1991 by Predator planes. You know what those are, they're the guided planes. Now, of course, with the Predator planes, if they're weaponized, you can take anybody out, They put a beam on there and send a weapon down, and that's the end of them. And Osama bin Laden's about 6'7". He's a Marfan syndrome. And so all the rest of the Arabs are little tiny guys, so they knew exactly who he was, they knew where he was. And so what did they do with the evil Osama bin Laden? Why, they canceled the Predator plane flights. And U.S. intelligence agencies at that time, in the year 2000, videotaped a meeting of 2 of the 9/11 hijackers in Malaysia. From January to May, they monitored a man named Muhammad Atta over in Germany. Muhammad Atta, who we are told led the attack on 9/11. In October, the USS Cole was bombed in Yemen, and of course they had advanced knowledge there was going to be an attack. I have an article out of the New York Times where actually one of the Pentagon officials resigned. He said, I told you there was going to be an attack. Now, why did they put it in port? I mean, they had fuel ships. You could fuel them out in the ocean. You didn't have to bring it into port. When you bring a naval ship into a port, and my son was in the Navy, you have big signs that says, get close to the ship, we'll blow you out of the water. But the people, knowing full well that there was going to be an attack on our ships, why the men on ship were ordered not to shoot unless they were shot at. And as the boat came in, people waving on the little boat as it approached the Cole. Why, of course, we couldn't shoot because he had orders not to shoot unless we shot at. And 17 sailors died, and how many dozens and dozens were injured. What's wrong with this story? Well, in the year 2001, the roadmap for national security comes out very early in the year, and that, of course, is the plan for the Office of Homeland Security. You see, everything's scripted. Office of Homeland Security did not come up after 9/11. It came up waiting for 9/11 so that we could go ahead and begin to implement this. And of course, contrary to everything you have been told, why we had people within Al-Qaeda who were feeding us information. We're told, oh, we had no idea because, of course, there was no human intelligence. Well, if you believe that, there is no human intelligence. Or you're probably waiting for Enron stock to come back again. Now, in 2001, why the State Department was issuing visas to known terrorists. They gave Muhammad Atta a visa in July of that year. The NSA was monitoring conversations between the terrorists. Jordan warned us about the attack. Morocco had infiltrated Al-Qaeda. They warned us about the attack. The Russians warned us about the attack. The Germans warned us about the attack. One of the hijackers was questioned in the Arab Emirates at the request of our officials in January of the year. Special Agent Robert Wright wrote a memo in June or July of that year. And basically, he said this: there is virtually no effort on the part of the FBI's International Terrorism Unit to neutralize known suspected terrorists residing within the United States. Now, why would that be? We know the terrorists are here, we know they're planning attacks, and we're not doing anything to neutralize them. Why did that happen? The airlinebiz.com website, June 23rd, said there's a major state of mobilization among Osama bin Laden's forces. India Reacts.com, June 26th, reported there's military action is being planned against the Taliban by United States forces. On July 4th through 10th, Osama bin Laden, the wicked Osama bin Laden, was being treated at the American hospital in Dubai. And of course, he's being visited by members of his family and by the local CIA agent. The story is in the Washington Times, it's in Le Figaro. And of course, you wonder, is it really true? Well, somebody sent me an article out of some obscure newspaper here in the United States, an article by a woman who has been working over there. And she said, you know, one of my friends, just casually in the process of the article, one of my friends saw Osama bin Laden at the American hospital in Dubai in July of 2001. July 5th, why Richard Clark, who was in charge of counterterrorism at the State Department, calls in all of the domestic security agencies. That's the FBI, that's the Customs, that's INS, that's the Coast Guard, and tells them to increase their security in light of the impending attack. July 5th, 2001. They know the attack is coming. July 17th, U.S. officials told Niaz Niak, and he's at a meeting over in Berlin, and the article, you'll find this in many places quoted. You'll find it in a book called The Forbidden Truth, among others, that U.S. officials told Niaz Niak there would be military action in Afghanistan by mid-October. In other words, we plan to go to war with the Taliban. But how would we ever go to war with the Taliban? I mean, what American in July of last year wanted to go to war over there? And the only reason that we would go to war if there was a perceived direct external threat. That in July 17th, the U.S. Immigration Service issued a Muhammad Atta, who is a known terrorist, who we've been monitoring in Europe. In the year 2000, we were monitoring him in the year 2001. How many of you heard the stories about Muhammad Atta meeting with the Iraqi intelligence officer? How do you think we knew that? We were monitoring him. He was being monitored over in Spain by the French intelligence. You know, the CIA is working with him. 2001 August. Osama bin Laden's associates were told to return to Afghanistan by September 10th. Word is out. I mean, we're intercepting all of the conversations. NSA is getting all of this information. Deputy Director John O'Neill resigned from the FBI. He was in charge of counterterrorism. He wasn't allowed to do anything. He knew we were being set up. Some kind soul got him a job, Director of Security in the World Trade Center, and he was on the 110th floor on September 11th. Well, that's one way that he'll never discuss what he knew. Sort of like William Sullivan, who had been the executive assistant to J. Edgar Hoover at the time of the Kennedy assassination. According to information we have, he was the go-between between the FBI and the CIA and the cover-up of the truth of the Kennedy assassination. He had a falling out with J. Edgar Hoover, resigned from the FBI, went out on his front porch and was shot. Somebody thought he was a deer. At least that's the story that Gregory Douglas tells, and we've done a number of interviews with him on his excellent book, Regicide, which is based upon the CIA files on the murder of an American president, President Kennedy. Well, and of course, in August, why the Mossad warns the CIA and the FBI there's going to be an attack. David Shippers, you remember David Shippers? He was the fellow who had been hired by Jana Davis. He had been in charge of the House impeachment hearings, and David Shippers is notified by a couple of FBI agents. He knows that there's going to be a major attack on lower Manhattan in the next 6 weeks. He goes to everybody in Washington, D.C. he can get, and tries to get to Ashcroft. Ashcroft won't see him. He tries to get to other people he knows, because he knows all these people. He's been in Washington, D.C. Nobody wants to talk to him about the coming attack. Dr. Garth Nicholson is a man I've known, interviewed a number of times. He was formerly a professor at the MD Anderson Clinic in Houston. He has over 525 peer-reviewed articles, one of the most prolific writers I've ever heard of. He edits I don't know how many scientific journals. He's a researcher, but because he's been involved with the Gulf War research, he has contacts with people in government. And he claims that he was notified by FBI officials and told there was going to be an attack, and it was going to be on the Pentagon. It was going to be on September the 11th. Nothing was said about the World Trade Center. He told me that he had personally notified people at highly placed in government about the impending attack. So on August 6th, we know that President Bush was briefed and told that the Islamic terrorists planned to hijack American planes. Now, we don't have any mention of the World Trade Center or crashing those planes. They were going to hijack American planes. Now, if you were the President of the United States and you knew that they planned to hijack planes, what would you do? Well, the first thing you'd do would be to warn the airlines, wouldn't you? And then, of course, you might suggest arming the pilots, reinforcing the doors. I mean, it's very simple to reinforce the doors. You could probably do it in 30 minutes with any door. They wouldn't be bulletproof, but at least you put a bar across there and it goes up and down like that on the hinge, and they couldn't break in. You might announce you were going to put marshals on the planes. You might not even be able to do it. We have marshals on some of the planes, but at least you would create that perception. You might scare off the hijackers. What did our fearless president do? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. He knew a major crime was going to be committed, and he didn't do anything. Why? On August 16th, a man named Zacharias Masui, or Mastriawi, I never can quite pronounce that, he is, of course, arrested in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He is up there learning to fly a 747. He said that well, the flight instructor was concerned because he really wasn't concerned about takeoffs and landings. He just wanted to learn how to steer it. His excuse was he wanted to take some of his family sightseeing on the plane. The local people in the office thought this was suspicious. They realized he was training for a kamikaze flight. They seized his laptop computer. They asked the people in Washington, D.C. to give them permission to go through the laptop computer. And they altered Colleen Rowley's report. Colleen Rowley was in charge of the office up there, submitted the report. They altered it in Washington, D.C. and changed it so that there would be no way that they could be possibly get the permission. August 26th, the French government confirms that Massaoui is a suspected terrorist. He's affiliated with terrorism. Now there's every reason to go into his website. But of course, we're told, and Colleen Rowley said, she wrote a letter, and it's published in Time magazine, that the FBI intentionally suppressed efforts to get into the website. Now, we know that the FBI was going into this because I personally talked to the woman who runs the flight school in Norman, Oklahoma, and 2 weeks before the attack, and that would be approximately 28th of August, the FBI was down to her talking about Zacharias Massaoui. He had actually gone there to learn how to fly a plane. He couldn't even fly a single-engine plane, much less a 747, and yet, he flunked out. I mean, you pay an awful lot of money to learn to fly, and you keep coming back. They finally just said, you're never going to be able to learn to fly. They turned him loose. And so then he goes up, of course, to Minneapolis to learn to fly a 747. What's wrong with this picture? September 3rd, Salman Rushdie. You remember Salman Rushdie? He wrote the Satanic Verse. And Salman Rushdie, a publisher, is told by government officials that he is no longer to be allowed to fly on either American or Canadian commercial airlines unless there's special security precautions taken. After the attack, he gave an interview to the London Times, and he said, I think the government had advanced knowledge of the attack. And the reason I think this is because, that called my publisher and said I wasn't to fly on the planes. What was so interesting about this was the fact that the article, I found it up on a Nova website here, but they said, you know, we know the article appeared in the London Times, but it isn't on their website. I mean, it's not on the London Times website. All their articles are on the website, but this one. Well, we actually were able to, through a university, to get a copy of the article, so we know it's true. But who took it down off the website? Is somebody doing damage control? September 24th, and this article appears in the December 3rd Insight magazine. December 3rd Insight magazine. A former Iranian intelligence officer who defected to Germany called the FBI and said, they're planning on hijacking your planes and crashing them into the World Trade Center. A week beforehand, he told them. And according to my good friend, Dr. Dennis Cuddy, there was another Iranian student who called the FBI at the same time and gave him exactly the same story. On December 5th, why there appears to be shorting on the various exchanges, and of course this is being monitored. They're shorting American Airlines and United Airlines, and they're shorting the various financial institutions. Military bases across America are placed on alert. September 9th, the Foreign Intelligence Service intercepted a call from Osama bin Laden to his stepmother saying, big things are going to happen in 2 days, and then you won't hear from me for a time. On September 9th, the CIA presented their plan to destroy al-Qaeda to the President of the United States. Now, we know they'd been working on that plan. You can go to Time magazine, December 31st, January 7th, the Time Man of the Year article with Mayor Giuliani on the front. And there, in the article in the War Room, they will tell you, well, the CIA is working on a plan to take out al-Qaeda. So we were working on a plan to go to war with Taliban, no question at all about it. But how are we going to get the American people to go along with that? December the 10th. The Congressional Research Service comes out with a report talking about the danger of attacks on the United States. And let's see if we can get you the exact quotation on that. The warning that the danger of Osama bin Laden network. The NSA is intercepting telephone calls saying, good things are coming, watch the news, and tomorrow will be a great day for us. So the NSA has people intercepting these calls. Now, how do we know that? An article, June 4th, USA Today, some talking about the 35,000 pages of documents the CIA turned over to the Senate Intelligence Committee, and in that they talked about they had infiltrated al-Qaeda. They knew that they were planning on hijacking planes and crashing them into the World Trade Center and into the Pentagon. And for those of you who are skeptical, I just happen to have the articles right here, and we'll be glad to give you a copy at the end. Because the story is so incredible, but the big thing was the messages. Big things are going to happen tomorrow. Tomorrow, big things are going to happen. So they had a pretty good idea something was about to happen. Goldman Sachs office in Tokyo put a directive out to all of their employees not to go into any American office buildings owned by the American government in the next several days. Top Pentagon officials canceled their travel arrangements for the 11th of September. You can find the article, September 24th, Newsweek magazine, and they said, you know, we have been informed that top Pentagon officials canceled their travel plans for the following day. And then, of course, 10 o'clock that night, Mayor Willie Brown of San Francisco, one of the most depraved men of modern times, received a call from airport security telling him not to, Americans should be cautious flying the following day. Now, I read this article. One of my listeners, my radio program, sent me the article. I don't accept anything, you know, unless I can verify it. So I called Mayor Willie Brown's press secretary. He confirmed. Mayor Willie Brown, 8 hours before the attack, 10 o'clock the previous evening, had received a call from airport security telling him Americans should be cautious flying the next day. And yet, the Vice President of the United States said this unspeakable attack, I mean, we just never suspected it could occur. Well, the morning of the attack, planes began taking off just about 8 o'clock. Flight 11 took off just a couple of minutes after 8 o'clock. By 8:24, people listening to the controllers heard talk that suggested that the plane had been hijacked. At 8:45, that plane crashed into the North Tower. At 9:04, the plane crashed into the South Tower. Between 8:45 and 9:40, when the plane crashed into the Pentagon, was 55 minutes. Where were our fighter planes? You would think if they knew there was going to be an attack, there'd be fighter planes in the air. Wouldn't you think that? Where were the fighter planes? Well, they did dispatch a couple of planes, supposedly from Cape Cod. Now, these planes fly about 30 miles a minute. Cape Cod's about 200 miles away. And yet they got to the Pentagon 12 minutes after the plane had crashed in. Do you honestly believe that happened by mistake? Shortly after, within the first couple of days after the attack, this book was effectively banned in America. It was written by Robert Morey. It's called Islamic Invasion. It goes into the fact that the Islamic people are here. Many of these people have an entirely different outlook on America. And of course, some of them will be involved with terrorism. The book is published by Huntington House, according to Dr. Morey, who's a frequent guest on our programs, why all of the books were called back from bookstores across America. The publisher would not even sell him copies of the book himself, although the publisher gave him back the copyright. And the publisher was very nice, but he said, I cannot tell you who told me not to distribute the book. But I cannot distribute the book. And to this day, Dr. Morey does not know who suppressed his book, but somebody suppressed the book. The FBI agents, of course, immediately began to protect the members of Osama bin Laden's family who were living here in the United States. The Taliban, of course, offered to surrender Osama bin Laden to the United States if we just showed them the evidence he was involved in the hijacking, but we declined their offer. We said, you'll have to take our proof, our word, we have the proof, we want him. Then they offered to send him to a neutral country for trial. Why we declined that offer. They said they will evict him, and of course, if you evict him, you're going to get him because there's no place in the world he can go. I mean, he's the most hated man in the world. But of course, we turned down that offer because we wanted to go to war. How did the Bush administration address the terrorist threat? Well, they refused to close our borders. They sought amnesty for illegal immigrants. They continued to allow immigrants from terrorist nations to come to America. They allowed Saudi citizens to enter our country, despite the fact that 15 of the 19 terrorists were Saudi Arabian citizens. They blocked the arming of airline pilots. They opposed efforts to investigate 9/11. They got the Patriot Act enacted. In fact, as you know, no congressman was allowed to read the bill before they voted on it. And it contained all the onerous provisions that had been in Bill Clinton's legislation. He tried to get passed after the bombing of the Murrah building in 1995 and couldn't get through Congress, but they got it through after the perceived external threat of 9/11. Of course, they created the Office of Homeland Security. Most people think that this was because of the terrorist attack. This was planned long ahead of time. Everything is scripted. Everything is planned. And then, of course, now they took the Model State Emergency Health Powers Act. It's being introduced in states across the country, the most draconian legislation you ever saw that will restrict all of your freedom. And there are a number of unanswered questions. We all know about the anthrax attack, and we were told initially it was the right wing, maybe Saddam Hussein, but now it's become increasingly apparent this came from our military laboratories. It was American anthrax that was used. And the question is, how was it that Dick Cheney and his staff knew this was going to happen? Because on the very day of September 11th, on that evening, why Dick Cheney and the White House staff started on Cipro in anticipation of an anthrax attack. What did they know that the rest of us didn't know? There's a great deal of controversy now about Dr. Hatfield. Did Dr. Hatfield do it? Didn't Dr. Hatfield do it? Dr. Hatfield failed 3 polygraph tests. Dr. Hatfield passed his polygraph test. What they're doing is confusing us. They're hitting us with a lot of information that is distracting us from really important issues. The next would be the issue of the magic passports. Out of the flaming inferno of the planes crashing into the World Trade Center, one passport drifted to Earth, and this is reported in the Washington Post. We can get to the references to it. And it settled on the ground about 2 blocks away from the World Trade Center. It was the passport of one of those wicked hijackers. And if you believe that, you believe anything? Not only that, but out of the flaming inferno of Flight 93 that crashed in Pennsylvania. Why, one of the passports survived, and they had that up on the FBI webpage until recently. And then there was a man named General Muhammad Ahmad. And General Ahmad, of course, was the man who had financed Muhammad Atta. And this is covered in a number of articles, and we have that article here. India helped FBI trace ISI terrorist links. And of course, he was the head of Pakistani intelligence, which is a surrogate of the CIA. And he had one of his assistants wire $100,000 to Muhammad Atta. Now, this is all known throughout the world. It's just not known here in the United States. And it just so happened that Muhammad Atta was General Muhammad Ahmad was here in the United States on the morning of September 11th, conferring with his friends. And then, of course, we've asked why our military planes didn't intercept. And then the other thing is we're told our intelligence agencies had no idea who these people were, and yet within 24 to 48 hours, we knew who they all were. I mean, that is the most amazing police work in the world, and if you believe that, you're probably expecting Enron stock to come back again. We go to war. We're at war in Afghanistan. And of course, high officials are told the Washington Times that they really weren't trying to get Osama bin Laden. One of them said, I prefer to follow a bin Laden last policy. And if you nab bin Laden or kill him, a lot of the war would end up being over. How could we justify the war if we got Osama bin Laden? An amazing article. We didn't try to get Osama bin Laden. In November, just before Kunduz fell, and of course the Taliban is fighting the Northern Alliance. The Northern Alliance allows a ceasefire so planes can come in and take away some of the Pakistan citizens who are fighting with the Taliban, and at the same time other planes come in, a fleet of planes, and whisk away a lot of the Al-Qaeda. How could that happen? And then, for the skeptic, August 19th, Newsweek magazine, you can still get it, August 19th, Newsweek magazine, telling about the battle in Afghanistan. They're closing in on the Al-Qaeda. There are 1,000 of them, they're trapped. Some Afghan leaders now claim that Al-Qaeda leaders paid off another warlord to allow safe passage. Others, including Ali, who led the attack, claim that mysterious black helicopters swept in, flying low over the mountain at night, and scooped up Al-Qaeda's top leaders. 1,000 Al-Qaeda disappeared, assumed that bin Laden was with them. That's August 19th, Newsweek magazine, page 35, I think it is. Anyway, if you want the exact reference, we can get it for you. And of course, our government said, oh, well, those were our black helicopters, but we were just dropping off people from Special Forces. Well, nobody saw the Special Forces dropped off, but the Afghans saw all of Al-Qaeda disappear. Joel Skousen's a friend of mine, frequent guest on my programs. He told me a friend of his with a lot of good connections had been contacted by the Pakistanis. They said, we know exactly where Osama bin Laden is. We'll be glad to tell. Of course, I'm sure they'd like that $25 million reward. They came over, met with aides of Donald Rumsfeld, and they weren't the least bit interested in finding Osama bin Laden. And how do we understand all of this? You need to get this book, Dollars for Terror. It was written in 1999. And in that book, written by a journalist, a Swiss journalist. This book was published in Europe in 1999, published here in the year 2000. One of his friends had been killed by the Islamic terrorists. And this is what he said: where does the money come from? The real threat lies in Saudi Arabia and the other oil monarchies allied with the United States. In certain parts of the world, the CIA and its Saudi and Pakistani homologs continue to sponsor Islamism. If you get into my book, you begin to understand that there are forces that work behind the scenes. There's a book called The Ultimate Evil by Maury Terry. He talks about a secret satanic society. All of you have heard of the Son of Sam murders. Did you realize that David Berkowitz was part of a secret satanic organization? Bet you haven't heard that. Or that Charles Manson was tied into the process, this secret worldwide satanic organization. There is a spiritual hierarchy that rules the world. We have their publications. Here's what they say. The masters are a worldwide group of executives, adepts, and skilled in the various fields of work in the modern world, organized into a close network of communication throughout the world with representatives at all nations, both East and West, and working in closest cooperation. You'll find this in the introduction to the 32nd degree of Masonry in Albert Pike's book, Morals and Dogma. And you'll see the figure replicated at the top. You'll see the Masonic symbology. And what are they doing? They're standing on the dragon. They're standing on the dragon, the serpent that overlaps the world. And on page 321, Albert Pike says this: Lucifer the light bearer, strange and mysterious name to give to the spirit of darkness. Lucifer, the son of the morning, is it he who bears the light and with his splendor intolerable blinds feeble, sensual, or selfish souls? Doubt it not. You'll find this picture in Manly P. Hall's book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. Manly P. Hall was a Satanist, and he tells you when the Mason learns that the key to the warrior on the block is the proper application of the dynamo of living power. He has learned the mystery of his craft. The seething energies of Lucifer are in his hands. Skull and Bones, what is it? Organized in 1833. Your president is a member of it. His father was a member of it. His grandfather was a member of it. There have been 6 Bushes, part of Skull and Bones. What is Skull and Bones? It's a secret occult society. In 170 years, no person has ever broken the oaths. Why? Because they're so horrible and terrifying. But what does the 322 stand for? And the Lord God said, Behold, the man is become as one of us to know good and evil. And now lest he be put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord sent him forth from the Garden of Eden. You see, it all has to do with what began at the very beginning, the battle between good and evil. Here's Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, one of the most evil women in the world. And in volume 2 of her Secret Doctrine, she said this: It is but natural to view Satan, the serpent of Genesis, as the real creator and benefactor, the father of spiritual mankind, for it is he who is the harbinger of light, bright, radiant Lucifer, who opened the eyes of the automaton created by Jehovah, and he who was the first to whisper, In the day ye eat thereof, ye shall be as Elohim, knowing good and evil, can only be regarded in the light of a Savior. Who is their Savior? Satan himself. Let me take you back to the Battle of Rorke's Drift. And of course, it was a horrible, horrible battle. There were 87 people left. And of course, they could never stand another onslaught. And there were still thousands and thousands of Zulus preparing to descend on them. And of course, they waited for morning, waited for death. In the morning, on the ridge above them, the Zulus lined up, waved their spears, chanted, stamped their feet, turned and left. Because you see, they had washed their spears in the blood of the enemy. And they were really saluting the brave men there. I sort of look upon us as that group caught between the globalists on the one side and the savages on the other. And of course, what can we do? All we can do is fight and look to God for his protection, because believe me, this is not a political or ideological battle. It is a spiritual battle. It is being fought on a political and ideological and cultural battlefield. And like those defenders of Rorke's Drift, all we can do is do our best and hope that God will intervene. In Flanders Field, the poppies blow. Between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the lark still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amidst the guns below. We are the dead. Scarce days ago we lived, felt dawn, so sunset glow. Loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders field. And the answer to that came many, many years later when somebody wrote, In Flanders field the cannons boom, and fitful flashes light the gloom. While up above like eagles fly, the fierce destroyers of the sky, with stains the earth wherein you lie, is redder than the poppy bloom in Flanders field. Rest ye in peace, ye Flanders dead, the fight ye so bravely led, we've taken up, and we will keep true faith with you who lie asleep, with each across to mark his bed in Flanders field. Fear not that ye have died for naught, the torch ye threw to us we caught. 10 million hands will hold it high, and freedom's light shall never die. We've learned the lesson that you taught in Flanders field. And so in closing, let me simply give you one of my favorite poems. And it goes back of all that foes have plotted, back at all that saints have planned. Back of the schemes of men and demons is a higher, hidden hand. Warp and woof are heaven's making, every pattern clean and wise. Oft perplexed by heavenly standards, but clear and right to heavenly eyes. All earth agents act with freedom, choosing whether love or hate, faith in God or bold defiance. None are shackled, slaves of fate. Mysteries which hurt and baffle, past our power to understand, in the end are turned blessings by the sovereign hidden hand. And though the cause of evil prosper, yet his truth alone is strong, though our portion be the scaffold, and upon the throne be wrong. But that scaffold sways the future, for in the dim unknown standeth God within the shadows, keeping watch above his own. We are called to do our best. We are called to make people understand this is that eternal battle between good and evil, and we are called to be fighters, just as they were at Rorke's. And so thank you so much. God bless you all.
Psalms 2:2 says, "The kings of the earth will set themselves, and the rulers will take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed." What is that? That's a definition of a conspiracy. Any Christian that does not believe that Satan is working together with his group of leadership to bring in his new world order, to bring in the opportunity to destroy Christians, just doesn't understand. I was recently talking with one of our speakers, and I said, why do they want a new world order? Well, they want power. Well, why do they want power? Well, they want money. Well, why do they want money? Well, they want power. Well, why do they want money and power? Well, they want a world government, but why? I said, I believe it boils down to this. I think what Lucifer is trying to do is to bring every single person on earth down to one basic decision. Either you take the mark or you lose your head. I also believe, in the early days of my prophecy studying and research, I thought, Lord, I don't understand. Why would you let all the things in Revelation come upon the world? Why would you let such bad things happen to your people? And I prayed and I prayed and I just turmoiled about it. I wrote letters to different ministers. This is long before Prophecy Club. I said, what do you think? And finally the Lord spoke to my heart. And he says, I'm bringing them down to an X. You see, I believe that there's an X on the calendar. There's an X on the calendar, and no one goes past that X and makes a decision. Just like it says in Daniel, I believe it's in chapter 11, the judgment was set. The books were open. The beast is slain, and Jesus returns on the clouds. There's a time when the judgment is set. There's no one else that is able to say, Jesus, I receive you as Lord and Savior. There's a time when it's all over. And what God is doing is putting us all into a funnel, and He's squeezing and squeezing and squeezing, and He's taking away our nice paycheck. He's taking away our nice food and our nice water. And He's making us make a decision that this body of flesh, this body made of mud, is nothing. The whole objective, just like it says in Ecclesiastes 12, the whole duty of man, fear God and keep His commandments. He's bringing people down to a decision. Lucifer is bringing people down to a decision. Either you receive Jesus or you go to heaven, or you go to hell, one or the other. God is bringing them down to the same decision. He's making everyone make a decision by that X. By that mark, you've got to make a decision. Now, there's still time tonight before the mark. But the question is there time for you? Let me ask you a question. Now, I realize some of you are Christians, but I also realize some of you are sinning. I realize some of you are not Christians, especially those watching the videotape. So let's suppose this. Let's say you're driving home tonight. You turn the corner, and all of a sudden, there's a big dump truck right in your way. You slam on the brakes, your face hits the windshield, you wake up, you're at the pearly gates, and there's Jesus. He says, why should I let you into my heaven? What would you say? I've heard some of the strangest answers. Well, my dad's a pastor. I went to church. I haven't hurt anybody. I've been a good person. But what's your answer? Don't answer out loud, but mentally answer that. What would you do? Why should I let you into my heaven? how would you respond to Jesus? The correct answer is because you are my Lord and my Savior. You see, the first thing we have to realize in order to go to heaven, Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. We have to realize we're a sinner. Surprisingly enough, some people think that they haven't done anything wrong. I've talked to some of them. The next thing we have to realize is we cannot earn it. We cannot put enough in the plate. We cannot do enough for the poor to earn it. It's a free gift. Ephesians 2, verses 8 and 9 says, for it is by grace you are saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is a gift from God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Okay, if it's a gift from God, then how do we reach up and take that gift? Romans 10:9 and 10 gives the answer. It says, if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God has raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, but with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. What's it saying? It's simply saying this. It's not enough to say it, but not believe it. And it's not enough to believe it, but not say it. We've got to say it, and we've got to believe it. What? We've got to say that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, died on the cross. We receive his blood to wash our sins away. It's as simple as that. There is no other way under heaven whereby a man may be saved except the blood of Jesus Christ. John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh to the Father but by me. Jesus is the way, the only door. He is the door. If you'd like to go to heaven, if you'd like to have God's protection, if you want God to provide for you in the days ahead, yes, there's trouble coming. Count on it. Bank on it. Engrave it into marble. Yes, trouble is coming. Yes, 9/11 was bad. Worse things are coming. And you know what it all ought to point to? It shouldn't point to, oh, they got evil in the government. Oh, there's evil. We ought to know that. It should point to Jesus. Jesus is coming. I said Jesus is coming. Jesus is coming, and chances are he's coming in your lifetime. Do you understand what that means? That X is coming up, and it may be tonight for you. Do you have Jesus in your heart? Our God is a relationship God. Do you know Jesus like you know the driving laws? Do you know Jesus like you know your Social Security number? Or do you know Jesus like he's your friend? Like he's your provider? Do you talk to him? Does he talk back to you? If you want to go to heaven, you want his protection, then you pray this prayer with me. Everyone bow your heads. You may have said it. I've said it 100 times. I say it every day. It's good to say it. It's like eating. Good to do it every day. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I admit that I'm a sinner. And I confess with my mouth. And I believe in my heart that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, died on the cross. I receive his blood to wash my sins away, to write my name in the book of life, to keep me holy, and to save me in the day of trouble. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, there's a lot of folks who will say, that's all you got to do. Pray that prayer. Now you're going to heaven. That's not what my Bible says. Matthew 7:21 says, not everyone that cries, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but those that doeth the will of the Father. What's the will? He says, if you love me, you keep my commandments. He says, be ye holy, for I am holy. He wants us to walk in his footsteps. He wants us to try our best to be holy. Now, I know some of us Christians haven't. We've slidden. It's a slippery slope. It's easy to slide. And I believe that there's some people in here right now that God is nudging your heart, and it's time for you to rededicate yourself. I also believe there's some people in here right now tonight that need to make a public profession. It's not enough for you to just say that prayer, but you need to confess with your mouth before people. Matthew 10:32-3 says, whosoever confesses me before men, him will also confess before my Father which is in heaven. But whosoever denies me before men, him will I also deny before my Father which is in heaven. You have to confess it before men. So if you just prayed that prayer for the very first time, promise I'm not going to embarrass you. If you just prayed it for the very first time, raise your hand, please. All right, if you prayed that prayer rededicating your life to wash some of the mud off that we all get on us from time to time, raise your hand. Okay? If you raised your hand in either group, please stand. I have one quick question. Please stand. One quick question. Who's your Lord and Savior? Who's your Lord and Savior?